The war was finally over. Deep within the ancient walls of Hogwarts, the fires of battle had faded into drifting smoke, and the castle stood beneath the quiet Scottish sky once more. For the first time in many years, the wizarding world faced a future no longer shaped by Voldemort's shadow. But peace did not arrive all at once. The years that followed were filled with rebuilding, remembrance, and slow transformation. Old families carried grief into a new age, while younger generations inherited a world forever changed by sacrifice. Tonight, we will journey together through everything that happened after the Deathly Hallows and beyond the final battle at Hogwarts. The Battle of Hogwarts ended in the earliest hours of the morning beneath a cold spring sky. The final echoes of spells had faded from the grounds, leaving behind only drifting smoke, shattered stone, and the distant crackling of fires that still burned along the edges of the castle. The great hall, which for centuries had welcomed students beneath floating candles and enchanted ceilings, had become something else entirely. Long wooden tables had been pushed aside to make room for the injured and the dead. Torn banners hung from the high walls. Dust drifted slowly through the torchlight. The smell of smoke, potion fumes, damp earth, and broken masonry lingered in the ancient air. For a long while, nobody truly celebrated. There had been cheering when Voldemort fell. There had been cries of relief and disbelief as his body collapsed onto the stone floor. But exhaustion quickly settled over Hogwarts like heavy fog rolling across the Scottish hills. Many of those who survived could barely process what had happened. Some sat silently against broken walls, still clutching their wands. Others wandered the corridors, searching for friends or family members who had not returned from the battle. The wounded filled every available space inside the castle. Madame Pomfrey moved tirelessly between rows of injured witches and wizards, assisted by professors, older students, and volunteer healers who had arrived from surrounding magical communities. Once news spread that Voldemort's forces had fallen, temporary hospital stations appeared throughout the school. Classrooms once used for charms or transfiguration lessons now held stretchers and potion supplies. Blankets covered the cold stone floors, while healing charms flickered softly in the dim light. Outside, the grounds of Hogwarts carried the scars of war. The bridge leading toward the entrance courtyard had partially collapsed during the fighting. Great sections of stone wall had been shattered by curses and explosions. Burn marks stretched across the grass near Hagrid's hut, where giants had fought during the night. The Forbidden Forest stood dark and silent in the distance, its trees disturbed by the movement of spiders, centaurs, and Death Eaters only hours earlier. The Black Lake reflected the pale light of dawn quietly, almost untouched by the violence nearby. Giant squid tentacles occasionally disturbed the surface far from shore, as if the creature beneath the water sensed the strange stillness that had settled over the castle. Throughout the morning, survivors began gathering the dead. Some bodies were moved gently into the great hall beneath white sheets. Others were found farther from the castle among broken trees or fallen stone. Friends carried friends. Family members knelt beside loved ones in silence. The grief moved through Hogwarts slowly and heavily, replacing the chaos of battle with something quieter and deeper. Fred Weasley's body rested near the centre of the hall, beside Remus Lupin and Nymphadora Tonks. Colin Creevey, far younger than many who had fought, lay nearby after returning secretly to battle, despite being underage. Lavender Brown's fate remained uncertain in the confusion of the aftermath, though many believed she had not survived Fenrir Greyback's attack. Around them were witches and wizards from every house and every generation who had died defending the school. The divisions that once shaped Hogwarts no longer seemed important. Gryffindors stood beside Slytherins in silence. Ravenclaws helped carry the wounded with Hufflepuffs. Students who had spent years competing for house points now worked together without hesitation, united not by school rivalry, but by survival. Harry Potter himself moved through the castle almost unnoticed, despite everything that had happened. Many students stared when he passed, but few approached him. He looked exhausted beyond words. Dirt and dried blood marked his face and clothes. The pressure that had defined his entire life since infancy had finally disappeared, leaving behind only emptiness and fatigue. For the first time since learning he was a wizard, Harry no longer carried the burden of Voldemort's survival. Yet freedom felt strange. He spent much of the day moving quietly through damaged corridors with Ron and Hermione, checking on survivors and speaking softly with teachers. At one point, he entered the headmaster's office alone. The circular room above the school remained mostly untouched by the battle. Portraits of former headmasters watched him silently as morning light filtered through the windows. There, Harry used the Elder Wand to repair his own broken Holly Wand. The wand that had belonged to him since the age of 11 slowly fused itself back together beneath the Elder Wand's power. It was a small moment in comparison to the war that had just ended, yet it mattered deeply to Harry. His wand represented far more than magic. It represented his years at Hogwarts, his friendships, his losses, and the identity he had built across countless battles. After repairing it, he kept his promise to himself. The Elder Wand, too dangerous to remain in human hands forever, would eventually be returned to Dumbledore's tomb. Elsewhere in the castle, the surviving members of the Order of the Phoenix began discussing what would happen next. Voldemort was gone, but much of magical Britain remained unstable. Death Eaters had infiltrated nearly every major institution during the previous year. The Ministry of Magic had fallen under dark control. Entire departments would need rebuilding from the ground up. Kingsley Shacklebolt quickly emerged as the central figure guiding the immediate recovery effort. Calm, respected, and trusted by both the Ministry and the Resistance, he naturally stepped into leadership during the fragile hours after the battle. Aurors loyal to Voldemort were arrested or fled. Messages spread rapidly through magical Britain, confirming what many had barely dared to hope. The Dark Lord was dead. Owls carrying the news crossed the country before noon. Patronus messages flashed between hidden safe houses and magical villages. Across Britain, witches and wizards emerged cautiously from hiding places where they had spent months living in fear. Families who had whispered Voldemort's name only in secret finally spoke openly again. In Diagon Alley, shopkeepers slowly reopened doors that had remained shuttered during the darkest period of the war. In Hogsmeade, villagers gathered quietly outside homes and inns, trying to understand whether the nightmare had truly ended. Some wept openly upon hearing confirmation that Hogwarts still stood. Others simply sat in silence. For many older witches and wizards, Voldemort's defeat felt almost impossible to comprehend. 2 wars had shaped entire generations. Fear had become part of daily life for decades. Even after his death, people expected darkness to return somehow. Rumors spread quickly that perhaps he had survived again or hidden another Horcrux. It would take time before trust returned fully to the wizarding world. At Hogwarts itself, the house elves worked continuously beneath the castle, restoring order where they could. Broken dishes vanished from the kitchens. Damaged furniture repaired itself beneath waves of magic. Fires were extinguished one corridor at a time. Creature personally led many of the elves through the ruined sections of the school, after fighting proudly during the battle beneath Regulus Black's old locket around his neck. The centaurs eventually withdrew back into the Forbidden Forest after helping drive Voldemort's forces from the grounds. Thestrals wandered the edges of the forest quietly beneath the pale morning light. Even Peeves the poltergeist drifted through damaged corridors, singing strange victory songs, while occasionally helping clear rubble, though mostly causing additional confusion. By evening, the exhaustion across Hogwarts deepened further. The castle no longer sounded like a battlefield. Instead, it sounded tired. Soft footsteps echoed through broken hallways. Murmured conversations drifted beneath floating candlelight. Somewhere far above, shattered windows rattled gently in the cold wind sweeping across the towers. Professors began organizing temporary sleeping arrangements for survivors unable to leave immediately. Many students refused to sleep at all, unwilling to close their eyes after witnessing so much death. Others collapsed from pure exhaustion inside common rooms or beside friends in the Great Hall. For the first time in centuries, Hogwarts had fought not merely as a school, but as a fortress, and it had survived. The ancient castle now carried fresh scars alongside the older secrets hidden deep within its stone walls. Some damage would be repaired within weeks. Other wounds would remain visible for years. Certain empty seats at future feasts would quietly remind students of those who never returned. Yet even amid grief, Hogwarts endured as it always had. The enchanted ceiling still reflected the night sky above Scotland. The moving staircases still shifted through the castle's towers. Portraits still whispered from their frames. Somewhere beneath the school, the black lake still moved gently against the shore as moonlight touched the water. And slowly, as the long day faded into night, the wizarding world began taking its first uncertain steps into a future beyond Voldemort's shadow. In the weeks that followed the Battle of Hogwarts, the castle remained partially closed to the outside world. Though Voldemort had fallen, Hogwarts itself had been wounded deeply by the fighting. Entire sections of the ancient school stood broken beneath the pale Scottish sky. Towers had collapsed inward. Bridges hung over empty space where stone had once connected the castle's courtyards. Burn marks stretched across centuries-old walls, blackened by curses and dragonfire. Yet even damaged, Hogwarts remained alive. The moving staircases still shifted slowly through the towers each morning. Portraits whispered nervously within their frames. The enchanted ceiling above the Great Hall still reflected drifting clouds and passing rainstorms over the highlands. Beneath the castle, the giant squid continued gliding silently through the dark waters of the Black Lake, as if the ancient creature understood that Hogwarts had survived another age of darkness. The rebuilding began almost immediately. Professors who had fought only hours earlier now walked the corridors with construction teams from the ministry. Skilled witches and wizards arrived carrying crates filled with restoration potions, replacement stone, magical tools, and enchanted scaffolding. Some specialized in structural charms. Others repaired magical enchantments woven into the castle over centuries. The work proceeded carefully because Hogwarts was unlike any ordinary building. The castle itself possessed layers of ancient magic, far older than many modern spells. Certain walls shifted according to magical intention. Staircases responded unpredictably to repairs. Hidden passages appeared unexpectedly during reconstruction efforts, revealing corridors forgotten for generations. In several cases, workers attempting to repair damaged stone discovered rooms no living professor remembered existing. Professor McGonagall oversaw much of the rebuilding personally. Though exhausted from the battle and mourning many of her former students and colleagues, she moved through the damaged school with quiet determination. Students returning months later would remember seeing her standing among broken walls, late into the evening, directing repairs beneath floating lantern light, while cold Highland winds swept through shattered windows. The responsibility resting on her shoulders was immense. Albus Dumbledore was gone. Severus Snape was dead. Many older members of the Order of the Phoenix had fallen during the war. Hogwarts now belonged fully to the surviving generation, and McGonagall understood better than anyone that rebuilding the castle meant rebuilding confidence in the wizarding world itself. The damage inside the Great Hall alone required weeks of work. Portions of the enchanted ceiling had fractured during the battle, causing strange storms to appear indoors at unpredictable moments. Rain occasionally drifted gently downward onto the house tables, while lightning flickered across the floating darkness overhead. Teams of magical architects worked carefully to restore the enchantments, without damaging the original magic created centuries earlier. The long wooden tables were repaired next. Burn marks vanished beneath restoration charms. Torn banners representing the four houses were replaced slowly, one by one. Yet despite the repairs, certain changes remained permanent. Small memorial plaques appeared quietly along the walls, listing those who had died defending Hogwarts. The castle did not attempt to erase what had happened there. Throughout the school, classrooms required extensive restoration. The defense against the dark arts classroom had suffered particularly heavy damage during the Carrow's control of Hogwarts. Dark magical residue lingered in the walls, requiring specialized cleansing charms before students could safely return. Potions dungeons flooded twice during repairs, after unstable magic disturbed sections beneath the Black Lake. Herbology greenhouses shattered during the fighting had to be regrown almost entirely from scratch. Professor Sprout devoted herself to restoring the greenhouses personally. Under her care, damaged magical plants slowly recovered. Venomous tentacular vines regrew along repaired walls. Mandrakes once again filled the damp air with muffled cries beneath protective earmuffs. Slowly, the scent of fresh soil and magical herbs replaced the lingering smell of smoke left behind by the war. The house elves worked constantly beneath the castle. While many witches and wizards focused on visible repairs, the elves restored the deeper rhythms of Hogwarts life. Kitchens damaged by spells were rebuilt. Ancient ovens relit themselves beneath magical flames. Hundreds of cracked dishes repaired themselves in floating streams through the air, while elves hurried through corridors carrying supplies. Creature became an unlikely symbol of the rebuilding effort. The old elf who had once served the House of Black alone now led groups of Hogwarts elves proudly through the damaged school. He wore Regulus Black's locket openly while organizing repairs and food preparation with fierce intensity. Students returning the following year would sometimes glimpse him inspecting repaired hallways late at night, with surprising seriousness. Outside the castle, the grounds slowly healed as well. Hagrid worked tirelessly near the edges of the Forbidden Forest, repairing damage caused by giants and acromantulas during the battle. Fallen trees were lifted back into place with magic. Destroyed fences around magical creature enclosures were rebuilt. Thestrals returned cautiously to their usual grazing grounds, while centaurs resumed silent patrols deeper within the forest. The Forbidden Forest itself seemed quieter after the war. For many years, the woods had felt tense and watchful beneath Voldemort's growing influence. But now the ancient forest settled back into its older rhythms. Moonlight filtered peacefully once more through branches untouched by spells. Strange creatures moved unseen between the trees, while the distant sounds of magical wildlife drifted across the grounds during the night. The bridge leading from the castle toward the grounds required almost complete reconstruction after sections collapsed during the fighting. Workers suspended magically reinforced stone above empty air, while enchantments stabilized the structure beneath them. Students returning later would notice that parts of the rebuilt bridge looked subtly newer than the surrounding castle, though Hogwarts' ancient magic slowly blended old and new together over time. Meanwhile, discussions began about reopening the school. The ministry strongly encouraged Hogwarts to resume normal operations as quickly as possible. Magical Britain desperately needed stability after Voldemort's defeat, and reopening Hogwarts represented more than education. It symbolized survival. Yet many challenges remained. Some parents feared sending their children back to the castle where so many had died. Others believed Hogwarts would never feel safe again. Letters flooded the school asking whether protective enchantments had been restored fully. Ministry officials inspected the grounds repeatedly, ensuring no lingering dark magic remained hidden within the castle. McGonagall insisted that Hogwarts would reopen only when truly ready. She refused to rush the process for political convenience. During this time, discussions also emerged about students whose education had been interrupted by the war. Many seventh years had lost nearly all normal schooling during Voldemort's control of Hogwarts. Others had fought in battles, rather than studying for examinations. Hermione Granger made the difficult decision to return and complete her final year properly. Unlike Harry and Ron, who had spent much of the previous year hunting Horcruxes outside the school entirely, Hermione wanted to finish her education, despite everything she had endured. For her, returning to Hogwarts represented something deeply important. It meant reclaiming the ordinary student life Voldemort's war had stolen. Harry and Ron chose differently. Kingsley Shacklebolt personally offered both positions within the Auror office without requiring completed NEOS-T examinations. Their roles during the war had already proven their abilities beyond any formal testing. Neither wished to return to classrooms after surviving so much violence. Hogwarts remained deeply important to them, but their lives had already moved beyond ordinary school routines. Still, Harry visited often. Even after the rebuilding progressed, he sometimes returned quietly to walk through familiar corridors late in the evening when few students remained awake. The castle carried too many memories for him ever to fully leave behind. Certain places still felt suspended in time. The Gryffindor common room, the astronomy tower, the shore of the Black Lake, Dumbledore's office. Hogwarts had shaped nearly every important moment of his life. For the younger students returning after the war, however, the castle felt different in quieter ways. The atmosphere of Hogwarts changed permanently after Voldemort's fall. Before the war, many students had viewed the school as mysterious and magical, but ultimately safe. After the battle, Hogwarts became something older and more solemn. The castle had defended itself. Students entering the rebuilt Great Hall now passed memorials honoring those who died protecting the school. Stories of the battle spread rapidly through every house. First years listened wide-eyed as older students described enchanted suits of armor marching through corridors, giants attacking the grounds, and teachers dueling Death Eaters beneath the shattered towers. Even Peeves altered his behavior slightly after the war. Though still mischievous, the poltergeist occasionally drifted silently through corridors damaged during the battle, as if remembering the night Hogwarts nearly fell. The castle ghosts also became more reflective. Nearly headless, Nick spoke more often about the long history of conflict Hogwarts had survived across centuries. The Bloody Baron wandered Slytherin House more quietly than before. The scars of the battle remained visible not only in stone, but in memory. Yet slowly, ordinary life returned. Candles floated once more above the Great Hall during feasts. Owls crossed the sky, carrying homework and letters. Quidditch discussions resumed in common rooms. Students laughed again beside the black lake beneath cold autumn winds. And Hogwarts endured exactly as it always had, ancient, wounded, magical. A castle filled not only with ghosts and moving staircases, but with the memories of every generation that had passed through its halls. The war had changed Hogwarts forever, but it had not destroyed it. When Voldemort fell inside the Great Hall of Hogwarts, the Ministry of Magic did not immediately recover with him. The wizarding government that emerged after the battle was damaged almost beyond recognition. Entire departments had spent months operating beneath fear, corruption, and the influence of Death Eaters hidden within its walls. Many officials who once appeared loyal to magical law had quietly obeyed Voldemort's regime in order to survive. Others had disappeared entirely during the war, either fleeing into hiding or dying, resisting the ministry's collapse from within. In the days following the battle, the ministry building in London remained tense and uncertain. Aurors loyal to Voldemort attempted to destroy records before investigators could arrive. Several lower-ranking officials vanished overnight, abandoning offices filled with half-burned documents and cursed artifacts. Rumors spread rapidly through the magical community that hidden Death Eater networks still operated inside the ministry itself. For ordinary witches and wizards, trust in magical government had nearly disappeared. The ministry had failed repeatedly during Voldemort's rise. It had denied his return after the Tri-Wizard tournament. It had attacked Harry Potter and Albus Dumbledore through propaganda. Later, it had fallen almost completely beneath Death Eater control, while pretending to remain legitimate. Many magical families no longer believed their government could protect them from anything. Into this uncertainty stepped Kingsley Shacklebolt. Unlike many ministry officials, Kingsley emerged from the war with widespread respect. He had fought openly against Voldemort alongside the Order of the Phoenix, while maintaining connections inside the ministry throughout the conflict. Calm, intelligent, and deeply trusted by both Aurors and ordinary citizens, he became the natural choice to guide magical Britain through its recovery. Within days of Voldemort's defeat, Kingsley was named Temporary Minister for Magic. His first challenge was restoring basic order. The ministry building itself had become a symbol of fear during Voldemort's control. The grand golden statues inside the atrium had been replaced by terrifying monuments celebrating wizard supremacy. Muggle-born witches and wizards had been dragged into underground courtrooms and accused of stealing magic from pure-blood families. Dementors had guarded prisoners without restraint, while fear spread through every department. Now, all of that needed dismantling. The statue celebrating magical dominance was removed almost immediately. Ministry workers destroyed anti-Muggle-born propaganda that still hung throughout lower corridors. Investigators searched offices for dark magical objects hidden during the previous regime. Several rooms inside the Department of Mysteries were sealed temporarily after unstable magic was discovered connected to experiments authorized under Voldemort's control. The Auror office became the center of the ministry's rebuilding effort. Surviving Aurors who had resisted Voldemort returned openly for the first time in months. Others who had secretly worked against the regime from within emerged cautiously from hiding. Entire investigation teams formed almost overnight to track down remaining Death Eaters before they could regroup. The atmosphere inside the ministry remained deeply uneasy. No one knew fully who could still be trusted. Some officials claimed they had cooperated with Voldemort only out of fear for their families. Others insisted they had secretly resisted in small ways whenever possible. Determining guilt became far more complicated than simply identifying Death Eaters. Many witches and wizards had survived through silence rather than open resistance. Kingsley understood this better than most. Rather than pursuing blind revenge, he focused on stabilization first. The wizarding world had spent too many years divided by paranoia and fear already. Endless public purges risked creating even greater instability. Still, certain figures could not avoid justice. Trials began within weeks. Former Death Eaters captured after the battle were brought before the Wizengamot under heavy security. Some denied involvement despite overwhelming evidence. Others attempted to shift blame onto dead allies. Several claimed they had served Voldemort unwillingly beneath threats or the Imperious curse. The courtroom itself carried heavy memories. Only a year earlier, innocent Muggle-born witches and wizards had stood in the same chambers, accused of crimes they never committed. Now those responsible for such persecutions faced judgment themselves. Lucius Malfoy avoided Azkaban, largely because of his family's actions during the battle, and his eventual cooperation after Voldemort's fall. Narcissa Malfoy's lie inside the Forbidden Forest had saved Harry's life, though few outside a small circle knew the full truth immediately. Other Death Eaters were less fortunate. Many received long sentences inside Azkaban, yet even Azkaban itself soon became part of the Ministry's reforms. For centuries, Dementors had guarded the prison. The creatures fed upon despair itself, leaving prisoners trapped not only physically, but psychologically. Voldemort's rise had demonstrated how dangerous relying on such dark beings truly was. Dementors had abandoned the Ministry almost immediately, once Voldemort offered them greater freedom. Kingsley pushed quickly for change. Gradually, the Ministry reduced its dependence on Dementors as prison guards. Alternative magical security systems were introduced slowly over the following years. Auror patrols increased around Azkaban, while protective enchantments strengthened. Though the prison remained grim and isolated far out in the cold northern sea, its atmosphere changed slightly as the influence of Dementors lessened. Meanwhile, inside the Ministry itself, entire departments required restructuring. The Muggle-born Registration Commission was abolished permanently. Laws targeting non-pureblood magical families were repealed. Officials responsible for carrying out discriminatory policies lost positions across multiple departments. Magical creatures who had suffered beneath Voldemort's regime slowly regained basic protections under revised laws. Hermione Granger would later play a major role in many of these reforms, though in the immediate aftermath of the war, she remained focused on completing her final year at Hogwarts and helping survivors recover. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement expanded rapidly during this period. Fear remained widespread that surviving Death Eaters might attempt attacks or assassinations, while magical Britain remained vulnerable. Aurors conducted raids throughout the country, searching abandoned safe houses and confiscating dark magical artifacts. Some operations uncovered deeply disturbing discoveries. Entire hidden rooms filled with cursed objects were discovered beneath old pureblood estates. Illegal potion laboratories appeared in abandoned buildings outside wizarding villages. Several captured followers of Voldemort attempted to flee Britain entirely using illegal portkeys before Aurors intercepted them. Harry Potter and Ron Weasley became involved in many of these efforts almost immediately after the war, though neither had completed formal NEWT examinations. Kingsley personally recruited them into the Auror office. Their experience during the hunt for Horcruxes and the Battle of Hogwarts far exceeded ordinary training. Harry in particular became both a practical investigator and an important public symbol. For ordinary citizens, seeing Harry openly working alongside the Ministry restored confidence slowly. For years, The government had treated him either as a dangerous liar or an inconvenient reminder of Voldemort's return. Now the same institutions once used against him openly acknowledged the truth. It marked the beginning of a different relationship between magical Britain and its government. Still, rebuilding trust proved far slower than repairing damaged buildings. Many magical families remained frightened long after Voldemort's death. Parents hesitated before sending children back to Hogwarts. Shopkeepers installed additional security charms across Diagon Alley. Some witches and wizards avoided speaking Voldemort's name even after his fall, as though fear itself had become a permanent habit. Kingsley addressed this carefully. Rather than presenting the ministry as powerful and invulnerable, he acknowledged openly how badly it had failed. This honesty surprised many citizens accustomed to years of denial and propaganda. Public statements emphasized transparency, cooperation, and vigilance rather than false certainty. The Daily Prophet also changed significantly during this period. During Voldemort's control, the newspaper had operated largely as a propaganda machine, twisting information to support the regime. After the war, editors and writers faced enormous criticism for their role in spreading fear and misinformation. Gradually, new leadership emerged, promising more independent reporting. Even so, suspicion lingered. The wizarding world had learned painfully how easily institutions could be corrupted. Within the ministry, security measures became far stricter than before. Background investigations expanded. Entrance procedures changed. Departments handling dangerous magical objects operated beneath increased oversight. The Department of Mysteries, in particular, became more secretive after fears emerged that dark magical research conducted during the war might survive hidden within ministry archives. At the same time, magical Britain attempted to return to ordinary life. International relations slowly improved after years of instability. Foreign ministries sent representatives to London, offering assistance and reopening diplomatic cooperation, interrupted during Voldemort's rise. Trade routes normalized gradually. Magical schools outside Britain monitored events closely, relieved that the conflict had not spread farther across Europe. For younger witches and wizards, however, the post-war ministry felt very different from the one their parents remembered. The atmosphere became more cautious, but also more aware of its responsibilities. New generations entering government service carried memories of the war with them. Many had lost relatives during Voldemort's rise. Others had fought directly at Hogwarts despite still being students. They understood how fragile peace could be. Late at night, long after most ministry workers left their offices, the building itself often remained strangely quiet. The vast golden fountains in the atrium flowed peacefully once more. Paper airplanes carrying interdepartmental memos drifted slowly through restored corridors. Aurors patrolled beneath enchanted ceilings, while distant fireplaces flickered green with flu arrivals. Yet beneath the surface, calm, magical Britain continued healing from wounds far deeper than physical destruction. The Ministry of Magic had survived Voldemort's rule, but it emerged changed permanently by the experience. Its failures would not be forgotten easily. Future ministers, Aurors, and lawmakers would grow up hearing stories not only of the Battle of Hogwarts, but also of how quickly fear and corruption had once consumed the wizarding government itself. And so, the rebuilding continued quietly, one department at a time, not through grand speeches or dramatic victories, but through slow restoration, through repaired trust, through laws rewritten carefully beneath candlelit offices, through frightened citizens gradually believing once again that darkness would not immediately return. For the first time in many years, the ministry no longer served fear. It served recovery. For most of his life, Harry Potter had lived beneath expectation. Before he ever entered Hogwarts, stories already surrounded his name. As a child, he became the boy who survived Voldemort's curse. As a teenager, he became the center of rumors, fear, and prophecy. By the age of 17, he had walked willingly into death itself and returned. When the war ended, much of the wizarding world viewed him less as an ordinary person and more as a symbol woven directly into modern magical history. Harry himself never felt comfortable with that role. In the weeks after the Battle of Hogwarts, he avoided public attention whenever possible. Crowds gathering outside the ministry or Diagon Alley made him uneasy. Whenever reporters attempted interviews, he often disappeared before they arrived. Even simple visits to magical shops became difficult because strangers stared constantly or whispered as he passed. Many wanted to thank him. Others simply wanted to see him standing there alive. For Harry, however, survival brought an unfamiliar kind of emptiness. For years, every decision in his life had pointed toward Voldemort. Every danger, every lesson, every loss had led toward a final confrontation he had never truly expected to survive. Once the war ended, he found himself facing something strangely difficult, an ordinary future. At first, Harry spent much of his time quietly between several places. Grimmauld Place remained available to him through Sirius Black's inheritance, though he rarely stayed there for long periods. The house still carried too many memories of isolation and grief, despite Creature's efforts to improve it. More often, Harry visited the Burrow, where the Weasley family gathered together in the difficult months following Fred's death. The Burrow changed after the war. Laughter still existed there, but softer now. Molly Weasley watched her children more carefully than before, as though afraid another might disappear if she looked away. Arthur spent longer evenings sitting quietly beside the kitchen window, while magical radios murmured news updates from the recovering ministry. Ginny moved through the house, carrying her own grief beneath steady determination. For Harry, the Burrow represented something he had nearly lost forever during the war. It remained the closest thing he had ever known to home. His relationship with Ginny slowly rebuilt itself during this period, though not dramatically. The war had interrupted their time together so completely that both needed space to rediscover ordinary life again. Their bond deepened quietly through shared recovery rather than grand declarations. Long evenings at the Burrow turned into walks through rebuilt sections of Diagon Alley or conversations beside open windows while summer rain drifted across the countryside. Unlike many around him, Ginny never treated Harry as a legend. She understood too well the exhausted young man beneath the stories. Kingsley Shacklebolt approached Harry soon after the ministry stabilized enough to begin rebuilding formally. The Auror office desperately needed experienced witches and wizards willing to help track surviving Death Eaters and dismantle the remnants of Voldemort's network. Many older Aurors had died during the war or been corrupted by the regime itself. New leadership was urgently necessary. Harry accepted almost immediately. Part of this came from practicality. Hunting dark wizards was the only life he truly understood by that point. But deeper than that was a feeling Harry struggled to explain even to himself. Voldemort might be gone, yet the damage left behind remained everywhere. Families still feared hidden Death Eaters. Dangerous magical objects still circulated secretly. Children still woke from nightmares about the war. Harry could not simply walk away from that. Ron Weasley joined the Auror office alongside him, though neither completed formal seventh-year studies. Their experiences during the hunt for Horcruxes far exceeded traditional classroom preparation. Kingsley personally ensured both received accelerated training while participating in active operations almost immediately. The early years of Harry's Auror career were difficult and exhausting. Raids occurred constantly during the Ministry's reconstruction period. Some involved abandoned safe houses, hidden deep in forests, or beneath old pureblood estates. Others targeted smugglers trafficking cursed objects left over from Voldemort's regime. Several surviving Death Eaters attempted to flee Britain entirely, using illegal magical transportation before Aurors intercepted them. Harry quickly gained a reputation for remaining unusually calm during dangerous situations. Years spent facing Voldemort had altered his understanding of fear itself. Younger Aurors noticed that Harry rarely raised his voice during operations. He moved carefully, listened closely, and trusted instinct more than procedure when necessary. Though still very young, he carried an exhausted kind of confidence shaped by survival rather than ambition. Yet beneath this professionalism, the psychological effects of the war remained. Harry slept poorly for years after Voldemort's defeat. Certain sounds still pulled him instantly back into memories of battle. Crowded spaces sometimes left him tense without understanding why. During quiet moments, his thoughts drifted unexpectedly toward those who had died before seeing peace return. Fred Weasley, Remus Lupin, Sirius Black, Dobby, Albus Dumbledore. The list never truly ended. There were evenings when Harry returned from ministry work and sat alone for hours without lighting a single lamp inside Grimmauld Place. The silence after years of danger often felt stranger than conflict itself. For most of his childhood, survival had required constant vigilance. Now the world expected him simply to live normally. Learning how to do that took time. The wizarding public remained fascinated by him throughout these years. Wherever Harry travelled, whispers followed. Children stared openly inside shops. Older witches and wizards sometimes cried quietly upon recognizing him. Ministry officials frequently attempted to involve him in public ceremonies celebrating Voldemort's defeat, though Harry avoided most invitations whenever possible. He disliked fame even more after the war than before. What mattered to Harry was not celebrity, but rebuilding something stable from the ruins Voldemort left behind. Much of his work inside the Auror office focused not on glory, but on preventing future darkness from growing unnoticed again. Several major investigations during this period centered around confiscating dark magical artifacts hidden after Voldemort's fall. Harry understood better than anyone how dangerous such objects could become if ignored. Entire teams specialized in locating cursed items connected to former Death Eater families. Some artifacts resisted destruction entirely and required storage inside heavily warded ministry vaults. Harry also pushed for changes within the Auror office itself. He believed strongly that the ministry's earlier failures came partly from arrogance and denial. During Voldemort's first rise, too many officials ignored warnings until it was too late. Harry encouraged younger Aurors to remain observant, flexible, and willing to question authority when necessary. Over time, this helped shape a somewhat different culture inside magical law enforcement. Though he never enjoyed politics, Harry slowly became an important figure inside the ministry, regardless. His opinions carried enormous influence simply because of who he was and what he had survived. Younger witches and wizards entering government service often viewed him with almost uncomfortable admiration. Older officials treated him cautiously, aware that Harry represented moral authority far beyond official titles. Despite this, he remained deeply connected to Hogwarts. He visited the castle frequently during the years following the war, sometimes officially and sometimes simply to walk through familiar corridors alone. The school continued healing physically and emotionally after the battle. and Harry found strange comfort there despite the painful memories attached to so many places. The headmaster's office affected him most strongly. Dumbledore's portrait occasionally spoke with him during quiet visits late in the evening. Their conversations rarely focused on grand magical questions anymore. Instead, they discussed ordinary things: Hogwarts students, ministry reforms, the difficulties of peace after long war. For Harry, these visits provided a sense of continuity between past and future. He also developed a quieter friendship with Professor McGonagall during this period. The formality between student and teacher softened after everything they endured together. Though McGonagall remained strict as ever, Harry sensed the immense burden she carried rebuilding Hogwarts after Dumbledore's death and the battle itself. As the years passed, Harry's relationship with Ginny deepened into something calmer and steadier than the intense emotions surrounding their youth during wartime. Ginny eventually joined the Holyhead Harpies as a professional Quidditch player, before later working as a sports journalist for the Daily Prophet. Together, they slowly created the ordinary family life neither had fully experienced growing up. Their home eventually became filled with many things Harry once believed impossible for himself: peaceful mornings, children's laughter, quiet evenings without fear. James Sirius Potter arrived first, followed later by Albus Severus Potter and Lily Luna Potter. Fatherhood changed Harry profoundly. For perhaps the first time in his life, protecting others no longer meant fighting dark wizards directly. It meant creating safety, warmth, and stability inside a world finally beginning to heal. Even so, the scars of his past never disappeared entirely. Harry carried them quietly through adulthood, much as Hogwarts itself carried the marks of battle hidden beneath restored stone. Certain anniversaries always remained difficult. Returning to the Great Hall during memorial events sometimes left him silent for hours afterward. The sight of Dementors still unsettled him deeply, despite years of experience fighting them. Yet unlike Voldemort, Harry never allowed pain to isolate him completely. That became perhaps the greatest difference between them. Over time, Harry Potter transformed from the boy who survived into something less dramatic but far more enduring. A husband, a father, an Auror, eventually the head of the Auror office itself. A man who continued carrying grief and memory, while still choosing to build a future anyway. To the wizarding world, he remained a legendary figure long after Voldemort's fall. History books described his role in the war with increasing reverence as years passed. Children at Hogwarts whispered stories about him in corridors beneath floating candles, much as earlier generations once whispered stories about Dumbledore. But Harry himself never viewed his life that way. He remained simply a man who survived darkness and spent the years afterward trying quietly to ensure others would not have to endure it again. And somewhere deep within him, beyond fame or prophecy or history, a part of Harry Potter always remained the lonely 11-year-old boy standing beneath the enchanted ceiling of the Great Hall for the first time, discovering that Hogwarts had become the first true home he had ever known. Of all the survivors of the Second Wizarding War, Hermione Granger entered the years after Voldemort's defeat with perhaps the clearest sense of purpose. While many witches and wizards struggled simply to recover from grief and exhaustion, Hermione immediately turned her attention toward rebuilding the wizarding world itself. The war had exposed deep flaws within magical society, flaws she had recognized long before Voldemort seized control of the Ministry. Prejudice, corruption, fear, and inequality had not appeared suddenly during the conflict. They had existed quietly for generations beneath the surface of magical Britain. Hermione intended to change that. Unlike Harry and Ron, she made the difficult decision to return to Hogwarts and complete her 7th year properly. For some, this seemed unnecessary. Hermione had already played a central role in Voldemort's defeat and possessed practical experience far beyond ordinary education. Yet for her, returning to school represented something important beyond academic achievement. The war had stolen normal life from an entire generation. By finishing her education, Hermione reclaimed part of what had been interrupted. Hogwarts itself still carried visible scars from the battle when she returned. Certain corridors remained partially under repair. Memorial plaques honoring fallen students and teachers lined sections of the castle walls. The Great Hall felt quieter than before the war, its atmosphere permanently shaped by memory. Hermione noticed all of it. She also noticed the emotional exhaustion surrounding many returning students. Some had lost family members. Others still woke from nightmares about snatchers, dementors, or Death Eater raids. Hogwarts no longer felt entirely innocent, even beneath floating candles and enchanted ceilings. Yet Hermione threw herself into her studies with the same determination that had once made her the brightest student in her year. Professors relied heavily on her during reconstruction efforts, often asking for assistance, organizing damaged library collections, or helping younger students recover academically after months of disrupted learning under Voldemort's regime. The Hogwarts library itself required enormous restoration after the battle. Entire sections had suffered water damage during magical fires. Some books vanished completely during the Carrow's control of the school, while others remained hidden in sealed rooms for safety. Hermione spent long evenings among towering shelves, helping Madame Pince reorganize volumes covered in dust and ash. For her, there was comfort in the library's quiet order. Books had always represented safety and understanding during uncertain times. Even after surviving Horcruxes, war, and near death countless times, Hermione still found peace among ancient magical texts and softly turning pages. When she completed her education, Hermione entered the Ministry of Magic with ambitions very different from many older officials. She did not seek influence for prestige or personal power. Instead, she viewed government as the place where lasting change could finally occur. Her first position involved work within the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. To outside observers, the choice seemed surprising. Hermione possessed exceptional magical ability and could easily have pursued prestigious positions elsewhere within the ministry. But her experiences during childhood and war had shaped her understanding of injustice deeply. She remembered how house elves were dismissed or ignored by much of wizarding society. She remembered how goblins, centaurs, and other magical beings existed uneasily beside witches and wizards without equal treatment. Most importantly, she remembered Dobby, the small house elf who died saving her and her friends, remained one of the clearest examples in Hermione's mind of how magical Britain failed those it considered lesser. Even before the war, she had attempted to improve conditions for house elves through the Society for the Promotion of Elfish Welfare, though many students mocked her efforts at the time. Now, as an adult working inside the ministry itself, Hermione finally possessed the ability to pursue reforms more seriously. The Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures had long been one of the ministry's most complicated divisions. Centaur relations remained tense after centuries of mistrust. Goblin communities viewed wizarding authorities with suspicion. Werewolves faced widespread discrimination, even after the war exposed how fear often pushed marginalized magical beings toward darker movements. Hermione approached these problems carefully and methodically. Rather than attempting dramatic changes immediately, she focused first on improving communication between groups that rarely trusted one another. Meetings once handled through formal ministry decrees became more collaborative under her influence. Reports previously ignored were reviewed more seriously. House elf working conditions across certain ministry-connected institutions quietly improved. Some traditionalist officials resisted these efforts strongly. To many older, pure-blood witches and wizards, Hermione represented everything they distrusted about post-war reform. She was Muggle-born, highly intelligent, politically determined, and unwilling to accept old magical traditions simply because they had existed for centuries. Whispered criticism followed her through portions of the ministry during these early years. Hermione ignored most of it. Years earlier, she had endured insults from Draco Malfoy and prejudice from Voldemort's followers. Compared to surviving the war itself, quiet political hostility seemed almost ordinary. Over time, her intelligence and relentless work ethic earned respect even from many who initially doubted her. Hermione prepared obsessively for meetings, memorized enormous quantities of legal information, and worked longer hours than nearly anyone around her. Ministry employees quickly learned that arguing with Hermione without preparation usually ended badly. Still, she remained deeply compassionate beneath her intensity. Co-workers often noticed that Hermione treated junior staff members with unusual kindness compared to many senior ministry officials. Young employees struggling with paperwork or magical lore frequently found her staying late to help them quietly, rather than dismissing mistakes impatiently. Her experiences during the war had taught her how easily frightened people could be overlooked by larger systems. Eventually, Hermione transferred into the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, where her influence expanded significantly. The wizarding legal system required enormous reform after Voldemort's regime collapsed. Many laws passed during the war targeted Muggleborns directly or expanded ministry surveillance powers dangerously. Other older laws contained traces of pure-blood favoritism dating back generations. Hermione helped dismantle much of this quietly, through years of careful legal work. She possessed a rare combination of qualities that made her extraordinarily effective inside government. Unlike some reformers, she understood magical law in precise detail. Unlike many politicians, she genuinely cared about fairness more than popularity. And unlike older ministry officials shaped entirely by tradition, Hermione approached problems with both magical and Muggle perspectives. Her Muggle upbringing remained important to her throughout adulthood. Though fully part of the wizarding world by this point, Hermione never abandoned the broader perspective gained from growing up outside magical society. She understood how isolated and resistant to change wizarding Britain sometimes became. This allowed her to question assumptions many pure-blood officials accepted automatically. Meanwhile, her relationship with Ron Weasley matured slowly through these years into something steadier and more peaceful than the intense emotions surrounding their youth during wartime. Their bond had survived arguments, jealousy, fear, and nearly impossible danger long before adulthood arrived. After the war ended, they gradually learned how to exist together without constant crisis surrounding them. That adjustment took time for both of them. The war had conditioned their entire generation to expect danger constantly. Simple domestic peace often felt strangely unfamiliar. Yet slowly, ordinary life settled around them. Shared breakfasts before ministry work, quiet evenings at home, conversations about family rather than survival. Eventually they married and later welcomed Rose and Hugo Weasley into their lives. Motherhood softened certain parts of Hermione's personality but sharpened others. Her determination to improve the wizarding world intensified once she imagined the kind of society her children would inherit. Education, fairness, and safety became even more personal concerns. As years passed, Hermione's reputation within magical Britain continued growing steadily. Younger ministry employees admired her fiercely. Hogwarts students began studying some of her legal reforms in modern magical history lessons. International magical governments occasionally consulted her regarding post-war reconstruction policies and equality legislation. Yet despite increasing influence, Hermione never fully lost the habits formed during childhood. Friends still found her reading enormous stacks of books late into the night before important meetings. She still corrected factual mistakes automatically during conversations without realizing it. Her handwriting remained impossibly neat, even while drafting complicated legal documents at exhausting speed. Some things about Hermione Granger never changed. Eventually, her political rise carried her higher than nearly anyone could have predicted when she first arrived at Hogwarts as an anxious 11-year-old, clutching library books tightly against her chest. Hermione became Minister for Magic in later years, overseeing a far more stable and progressive wizarding Britain than the one that existed during Voldemort's rise. Her leadership style differed dramatically from many previous ministers. Hermione valued transparency over image, competence over blood status, collaboration over fear. Under her influence, magical education improved, creature rights advanced further, and international magical cooperation strengthened significantly. Still, she never viewed herself as some legendary figure. Like Harry, Hermione remained deeply shaped by memory. She carried the war quietly within her, even while helping build something better afterward. Certain names still affected her deeply. Dobby, Lupin, Fred, Dumbledore. The losses never vanished completely beneath professional success or political achievement. At times, long after becoming one of the most influential witches in Britain, Hermione still returned quietly to Hogwarts. She would walk through restored corridors late in the evening, while students laughed somewhere far away beyond moving staircases and torchlit halls. The library remained her favorite place inside the castle. Madame Pince eventually grew old enough that younger librarians took over daily responsibilities, but Hermione still visited the familiar shelves whenever she could. The Hogwarts she walked through as an adult felt different from the school she entered as a child. The castle carried more memorials now, more history, more silence in certain corners. Yet it also carried peace. Students once again worried mostly about exams, Quidditch matches, and house points, rather than dark wizards. Children born after the war viewed Voldemort as distant history rather than immediate terror. To Hermione, this represented the greatest success of all. Not political titles, not ministry influence, but the simple fact that younger generations could grow up without fear shaping every part of their lives. And so, Hermione Granger spent the years after the Deathly Hallows doing what she had always done best, studying problems carefully, challenging injustice relentlessly, protecting those others ignored, and helping rebuild a wounded world, one law, one institution, and one generation at a time. For the Weasley family, the end of the war did not bring immediate peace. Though Voldemort had fallen and Hogwarts still stood, the loss of Fred Weasley left a silence inside the family that never fully disappeared. The burrow, once filled constantly with overlapping laughter, noisy arguments, enchanted fireworks, and the chaos of many voices speaking at once, felt strangely incomplete during the months following the Battle of Hogwarts. Fred's absence existed everywhere. His old bedroom upstairs remained untouched for a long time. Half-finished joke products still rested inside boxes at Weasley's Wizard Wheezes beside notes written in his hurried handwriting. Family meals often paused suddenly when someone almost expected Fred to interrupt with a joke before remembering he no longer could. George suffered the loss most deeply. For nearly his entire life, he had never truly existed separately from Fred. At Hogwarts, they had been known together. At the joke shop, they had built everything side by side. Even their conversations moved with shared rhythm and instinct developed over years of identical thinking and constant companionship. Now George found himself alone in ways he had never imagined possible. During the earliest months after the war, he rarely spoke much at all. Visitors to the burrow often noticed him sitting silently near windows or staring at unfinished products inside the shop without moving. The missing ear he lost during the escape from Privet Drive seemed almost symbolic now, another permanent reminder of war and survival. The joke shop in Diagon Alley remained closed for a period after the battle. Its colourful windows and chaotic displays had once represented one of the brightest places in magical Britain. Even during Voldemort's rise, Weasley's wizard wheezes stood out defiantly against the growing darkness surrounding the wizarding world. Fred and George had built it not only as a business, but almost as an act of resistance against fear itself. Without Fred, reopening it felt impossible to George at first. Ron understood this immediately. Though he had already joined Harry in helping the Ministry track remaining Death Eaters, Ron spent much of his free time assisting George at the shop. Sometimes they worked silently for hours, organizing damaged inventory or repairing enchanted products disrupted during the war. Other times they simply sat together inside the empty store while evening light faded beyond Diagon Alley's windows. Gradually, very slowly, the shop reopened. The first customers entered quietly, uncertain how to behave inside a place so closely connected to someone many now viewed as a war hero. George himself struggled through those early days. Every joke item reminded him of conversations with Fred. Every invention carried memories attached to it. Yet something unexpected began happening as more people returned. Children laughed again inside the shop. Students visiting Diagon Alley before returning to Hogwarts filled the aisles, examining trick wands, portable swamps, and skiving snack boxes with the same excitement as before the war. Parents who had spent years living beneath fear watched their children smile inside the brightly coloured shop and realized how badly the wizarding world needed places like it again. George slowly understood that continuing the business honoured Fred more than abandoning it ever could. The Weasley family itself adapted to grief in different ways. Molly Weasley became even more protective of her children than before. During the war, she had nearly lost all of them repeatedly. Fred's death transformed those fears into permanent instinct. Family gatherings at the burrow became especially important to her afterward. She insisted everyone visit often, whenever possible, surrounding the house with food, conversation, and noise, as though silence itself had become dangerous. Arthur Weasley carried his grief more quietly. He spent long evenings working peacefully in the shed behind the burrow, repairing enchanted objects or tinkering with Muggle artifacts. Those who knew Arthur well noticed that he smiled less often after the war, though his gentle curiosity about the world never disappeared completely. He remained deeply fascinated by ordinary Muggle inventions, even while magical Britain rebuilt around him. Percy's relationship with the family changed profoundly after Fred's death. The guilt he carried remained immense for years afterward. Though Percy reconciled with his family before the battle itself, he never forgot that his final conversation with Fred occurred only shortly before the explosion that killed him. The memory haunted him deeply. In some ways, Percy spent the rest of his life trying quietly to make up for the years he wasted separated from his family through pride and ministry ambition. Over time, however, Percy became far warmer and more grounded than he had once been. The war stripped away many illusions he once held about authority and status. Family mattered more to him afterward than career advancement ever could again. Ginny Weasley also changed significantly during the years following Voldemort's defeat. Though younger than many who fought in the war, she had endured possession by Tom Riddle years earlier, and later resistance against the Carrows at Hogwarts. These experiences gave her a quiet resilience that shaped her adulthood strongly. Before eventually becoming a professional Quidditch player for the Holyhead Harpies, Ginny returned to Hogwarts to complete her education, alongside many students whose schooling had been interrupted by the war. Returning to the castle after so much violence felt emotionally difficult at times, but Ginny adapted quickly. Her confidence and humour helped stabilize many younger students still frightened by recent events. For Harry, watching Ginny rebuild her life after the war deepened his admiration for her enormously. The burrow slowly regained warmth as the years passed. Summer evenings, once again, filled the crooked old house with conversation, drifting through open windows. Gnomes still invaded the garden regularly, despite every attempt to remove them permanently. The kitchen remained crowded during holidays, while enchanted dishes washed themselves beside floating candles and magical clocks tracking family members' locations. Still, Fred's absence never vanished completely. Certain jokes remained unfinished because no one else could deliver them properly. George occasionally turned instinctively to share a thought with Fred before remembering he was gone. Molly sometimes paused while setting the dinner table, as though expecting one more chair to fill itself automatically. Yet the Weasleys survived the war the same way they survived most hardships. Together. Weasley's wizard, Wheezes, eventually became even more successful than before Voldemort's fall. The shop expanded beyond Diagon Alley over time, supplying joke products and magical innovations across Britain. George proved remarkably inventive, even without Fred beside him, though he never stopped thinking of the business as something they created together. Many products introduced after the war carried subtle tributes to Fred, hidden inside names or enchantments only close friends fully recognized. George himself matured quietly through grief. Though humor remained central to his personality, it became gentler in certain ways after the war. Customers still found him entertaining and unpredictable, but those who knew him well sensed the sadness beneath some of his laughter. Eventually, George married Angelina Johnson. Their relationship developed gradually from shared grief and long familiarity. Angelina had known Fred closely at Hogwarts before his death, which created an unusual emotional complexity between them at first. Yet over time, they built something steady and genuine together. When they later named their son Fred, the decision carried enormous emotional weight throughout the family. For Molly and Arthur especially, holding another small red-haired child carrying Fred's name brought both pain and comfort at once. Meanwhile, Ron slowly transitioned away from active Auror work after several years helping the ministry stabilize. Though highly capable in dangerous situations, Ron discovered he preferred a quieter life than constant investigations and raids. Eventually, he joined George at Weasley's Wizard Wheezes full-time, bringing both practical intelligence and deep family loyalty into the business. The partnership suited him far better than many expected. Ron understood people naturally in ways George sometimes did not after Fred's death. Together, they balanced one another effectively while keeping the spirit of the shop alive. Customers visiting years later still sensed traces of Fred throughout the business, though the shop gradually evolved into something reflecting both past and future together. Family gatherings at the Burrow became almost sacred after the war. Birthdays, holidays, and Sunday dinners drew the growing family back repeatedly beneath the crooked magical house's warm lights. Harry eventually became not merely a visitor there, but truly part of the family through his marriage to Ginny. Hermione and Ron brought Rose and Hugo. Bill and Fleur raised Victoire, Dominique, and Louis. Percy, Charlie, George, and the others returned whenever possible. The burrow itself seemed to expand emotionally to contain them all. Children ran laughing through the orchard during summer evenings, while older family members watched from mismatched chairs beside long, outdoor tables. The scars of war remained present in memory, but so did survival. That became the true legacy of the Weasley family after Voldemort's fall. Not perfection, not wealth or political influence, but resilience, warmth, loyalty, the stubborn refusal to let grief destroy joy completely. The wizarding world often viewed Harry Potter as the central hero of the war, and in many ways, he was. Yet the Weasleys represented something equally important. They showed what Voldemort could never understand. That love, expressed through ordinary family life, carried enormous power of its own. Inside the burrow, beneath crooked ceilings and enchanted clocks, magical Britain slowly healed one family gathering at a time. And though one laugh was missing forever, the sound of life continued there all the same. For centuries, the Malfoy family had stood among the oldest and most influential pureblood families in magical Britain. Their name carried wealth, political power, and long traditions built upon blood purity and social status. The halls of Malfoy Manor had once hosted ministers, ministry officials, and powerful witches and wizards who viewed the family as symbols of aristocratic magical society. After Voldemort's fall, all of that changed. The Second Wizarding War left the Malfoys alive, but deeply diminished. Their reputation across magical Britain collapsed almost overnight. Though Lucius Malfoy escaped imprisonment after the battle, few people forgot the role his family played during Voldemort's rise. The dark mark above the Malfoy drawing room, the imprisonment and torture of captives inside the manor. Years spent supporting pure blood ideology. These memories remained attached permanently to the family name. In the weeks following the Battle of Hogwarts, Malfoy Manor became strangely quiet. The vast estate, once filled with visiting Death Eaters and tense political gatherings, stood nearly empty beneath cold grey skies. Many servants disappeared after Voldemort's defeat. Ministry officials inspected sections of the property, repeatedly searching for hidden dark magical objects or evidence connected to surviving followers. Lucius Malfoy moved through the manor, almost like a ghost during this period. The proud confidence that once defined him had vanished entirely by the war's end. Voldemort's return had not elevated Lucius in the way he once imagined. Instead, it had destroyed much of what he valued most. His wealth remained, but his influence evaporated. His carefully maintained image of superiority collapsed into humiliation and fear. Years earlier, Lucius believed Voldemort's rise would restore pure blood dominance and strengthen families like the Malfoys. Instead, Voldemort reduced even his closest followers into terrified servants living beneath constant threat. By the final months of the war, Lucius no longer resembled the arrogant man who once mocked Arthur Weasley inside Flourish and Blots. His wand had been taken by Voldemort. His authority inside his own home disappeared. Fear consumed him completely. After the battle, that fear remained. Though not imprisoned in Azkaban, Lucius understood clearly that magical Britain would never fully trust him again. Publicly, he withdrew almost entirely from ministry affairs and political gatherings. The Malfoys remained wealthy, but increasingly isolated from the center of wizarding society. Narcissa Malfoy adapted differently. Of all the Malfoys, she emerged from the war, carrying perhaps the most complicated legacy. Her lie to Voldemort inside the Forbidden Forest saved Harry Potter's life, and ultimately helped bring about Voldemort's defeat itself. Yet this act did not erase her earlier support of pure-blood ideology, or her years spent within Voldemort's circle. Still, many who knew the truth quietly recognized that Narcissa's actions came not from loyalty to the light, but from love for her son. Draco remained the center of nearly every decision she made during the war's final stages. For Draco Malfoy, the years following Voldemort's defeat were shaped heavily by shame, confusion, and silence. Though still very young, by wizarding standards, he carried experiences that permanently altered him long before adulthood arrived. Voldemort had forced him into tasks no frightened teenager should ever face. The attempt on Dumbledore's life, the fear surrounding the Vanishing Cabinet, watching Death Eaters occupy his home, living beneath constant threat from Voldemort himself. The war stripped away nearly all Draco's childhood illusions. At Hogwarts, before Voldemort's return, Draco often treated cruelty like a game connected to family pride and school rivalry. He mocked others easily because he believed himself protected by wealth, status, and bloodline. Yet the reality of genuine darkness terrified him once it entered his life fully. By the Battle of Hogwarts, Draco no longer resembled the arrogant boy from Harry's first train ride. He looked exhausted, frightened, torn between loyalty to family expectations and horror at what Voldemort's world actually required. After the war, Draco withdrew from public life for many years. Unlike Harry, Ron, or Hermione, he did not become a celebrated figure helping rebuild magical Britain openly. Instead, he lived quietly, avoiding attention whenever possible. Public appearances became rare. He avoided crowded ministry gatherings and spent long periods away from Diagon Alley entirely. The wizarding world treated him cautiously. Some viewed him with hatred because of his family's history. Others pitied him as another young person manipulated by older generations during the war. Most simply remained uncertain what to think. Draco himself seemed uncertain as well. Those who occasionally encountered him during these years often noticed how subdued he became compared to his Hogwarts days. The sharp confidence in his voice softened considerably. Though still carrying traces of pride and formality shaped by his upbringing, he no longer behaved like someone convinced entirely of his own superiority. The war had forced him to confront difficult truths about the beliefs surrounding his childhood. Pure-blood supremacy, once presented to him as elegant tradition and family honor, revealed itself instead as fear, cruelty, and destruction. Voldemort's followers cared little for loyalty or dignity beneath the surface. Even old pure-blood families became disposable once they ceased being useful. This realization changed Draco permanently. Over time, he gradually rebuilt a quieter life, separate from many older Malfoy traditions. He eventually married Astoria Greengrass, another pure-blood witch whose views differed significantly from the harsher ideologies once common among elite magical families. Their relationship represented part of a broader shift occurring slowly within pure-blood society after the war. Many younger witches and wizards from traditional families no longer embraced the prejudices their parents considered normal. The horrors of Voldemort's rise exposed where such beliefs could ultimately lead. Draco and Astoria later had a son, Scorpius Malfoy. Fatherhood affected Draco deeply in ways few people expected. Those who remembered him as a cruel student at Hogwarts found it difficult imagining him as a gentle parent. Yet Draco became fiercely protective of Scorpius, determined in many ways to prevent his son from inheriting the same fears and expectations that shaped his own childhood. This did not mean Draco abandoned all traces of Malfoy pride or tradition. Malfoy Manor remained elegant and formal. Scorpius still grew up surrounded by old magical wealth and history. But certain attitudes changed noticeably. Draco no longer viewed blood purity as the defining measure of worth. More importantly, he no longer wanted his son raised beneath fear. The relationship between Draco and Harry Potter evolved strangely over the years following the war. They never became close friends in the traditional sense. Too much history and pain existed between them for that. Yet the intense hatred defining their school years gradually faded into something quieter and more complicated. Both understood things about the war that few others fully could. Each carried memories of Voldemort's presence in different ways. Each lost parts of childhood to the conflict. Each inherited expectations from older generations they never entirely chose themselves. Their children later attending Hogwarts together forced this uneasy peace into something more stable. Scorpius Malfoy especially became important in reshaping public perceptions of the Malfoy family. Unlike many expected, he grew into a kind, intelligent, and somewhat awkward boy who lacked nearly all the arrogance associated with older generations of his family. His friendship with Albus Severus Potter surprised much of magical Britain, precisely because it seemed impossible to older observers still trapped in memories of Harry and Draco's rivalry. Yet younger generations viewed the world differently. To children born after the war, Voldemort represented history rather than immediate fear. House rivalries remained important at Hogwarts, but old divisions surrounding blood status weakened gradually over time. This shift unsettled some older, pure-blood families deeply. The decline of blood supremacy ideology after Voldemort's fall happened slowly but unmistakably. Public support for openly prejudiced policies collapsed almost entirely. Ministry reforms strengthened protections for Muggleborns and magical creatures alike. Hogwarts itself grew somewhat more unified after surviving war together. Families like the Malfoys could not avoid adapting to this new world. Lucius never fully accepted these changes privately, though advancing age and reduced influence limited his ability to resist them meaningfully. Narcissa focused almost entirely on family rather than politics after the war. Draco, meanwhile, seemed content allowing old traditions to fade quietly rather than fighting to preserve them. There remained sadness inside Malfoy Manor long after Voldemort's defeat. The family survived physically, but much of what once defined their identity disappeared permanently. Their reputation never fully recovered. Old alliances dissolved. Ministry influence weakened drastically. Certain sections of magical society continued viewing the Malfoys with permanent suspicion, no matter how much time passed. Yet survival itself became enough for them eventually. Late in the evenings, Malfoy Manor no longer hosted fearful gatherings of Death Eaters beneath dark chandeliers and whispered threats. Instead, the vast house grew quieter with age. Fireplaces flickered softly through long corridors, while portraits of ancient Malfoys watched changing generations pass beneath them. Draco sometimes walked those corridors alone after Scorpius fell asleep, reflecting perhaps on how close everything came to destruction. He understood more clearly than most how seductive fear could become when disguised as tradition or superiority. He also understood how quickly darkness consumed those who believed they could control it safely. The Malfoy family emerged from the war, diminished, humbled, and permanently altered. But unlike Voldemort, they survived long enough to change. And in the quieter years that followed the Deathly Hallows, that change mattered more than many people realized at the time. When Hogwarts reopened fully after the war, the castle welcomed a generation of students unlike any it had taught before. The children arriving beneath the enchanted ceiling of the Great Hall carried memories shaped by conflict, even if many had been too young to understand the war itself completely. Some remembered hiding with families, while Death Eaters controlled the ministry. Others remembered hearing whispered conversations about Voldemort late at night behind closed doors. A few had older siblings who fought during the Battle of Hogwarts and never returned home afterward. The atmosphere inside the school changed quietly during these years. Before the war, Hogwarts often felt ancient, mysterious, and adventurous. After Voldemort's fall, the castle carried a deeper sense of memory. Students still laughed in corridors and hurried toward classes beneath moving staircases, but they also understood that the school itself had survived something terrible. The memorials placed throughout Hogwarts ensured nobody forgot entirely. Inside the Great Hall, plaques listing fallen students and teachers remained visible beside restored house banners. Portraits spoke openly about the battle to curious younger students who asked questions late at night. Certain damaged sections of stone, left intentionally unrepaired, became quiet reminders of the night Hogwarts defended itself against Voldemort's army. Professor McGonagall guided the school carefully through this transition. As headmistress, she understood that Hogwarts needed to become both a place of learning and a place of healing. Students returning after the war often carried emotional scars invisible to others. Some struggled sleeping in dormitories after months spent hiding or fleeing. Others reacted fearfully to loud noises or sudden magical accidents during lessons. The staff adapted as best they could. Househeads paid closer attention to student well-being than in earlier years. The hospital wing expanded certain services related to emotional recovery. Common rooms became quieter and more supportive spaces, where older students often helped younger ones adjust to life, returning slowly toward normal. Defense against the dark arts changed, especially after the war. For decades, the subject carried instability and fear beneath the curse Voldemort placed upon the position. Teachers came and went constantly through disaster, corruption, or death. After Voldemort's defeat, the curse finally broke, allowing the subject to stabilize for the first time in many years. This transformed the classroom atmosphere entirely. Students still learned defensive magic, but the lessons no longer carried the same desperate urgency surrounding Harry's generation. During Voldemort's rise, learning defensive spells often felt directly connected to survival itself. After the war, the subject slowly became educational again, rather than purely protective. Still, memories of the conflict remained woven into the curriculum. Teachers emphasized the importance of recognizing dark magical movements early, before fear and prejudice could spread unchecked. Historical discussions about Voldemort's rise became more open and honest than before. Hogwarts no longer attempted to shield students entirely from difficult truths about magical history. The house system also evolved subtly during these years. Gryffindor, Ravenclaw, Hufflepuff, and Slytherin remained central to Hogwarts' identity, exactly as they had for centuries. Students still competed fiercely for house points and Quidditch victories. Rivalries continued filling corridors with arguments and celebrations alike. Yet something beneath those rivalries softened after the war. The Battle of Hogwarts forced all four houses to defend the castle together, despite their differences. Students who survived the conflict carried those memories with them afterward. Younger generations inherited a school where cooperation between houses became somewhat more common than before. Slytherin House experienced the greatest shift. For many years, Slytherin carried a dark reputation connected to Voldemort and blood supremacy ideology. Younger students entering the house after the war often faced suspicion from others, despite having no connection to Death Eaters themselves. McGonagall worked carefully to prevent the house from becoming isolated permanently. Slowly, perceptions began changing. Not every ambitious student belonged to darkness, and younger generations increasingly understood this distinction. Students born after the war viewed Voldemort as history rather than immediate identity. Friendships between houses developed more naturally over time, especially among those too young to remember the worst years directly. Meanwhile, Hogwarts itself continued healing physically. The rebuilt sections of the castle blended gradually with older stone until newer generations could barely distinguish repairs from original walls. The bridge destroyed during the battle stood strong again above the grounds. Repaired towers rose beside the Black Lake, while magical windows reflected drifting clouds over the highlands. Yet certain changes remained permanent. The Room of Requirement became almost sacred to some students, after stories spread about its role protecting Dumbledore's army during the war. The castle's secret passages attracted even greater fascination among younger students, hearing tales about resistance fighters moving through hidden corridors beneath Voldemort's control. Peeves frequently exaggerated these stories dramatically, while floating through hallways, singing strange songs about the battle. Hagrid remained one of the most beloved figures at Hogwarts throughout this period. Though older and wearier after the war, he continued teaching care of magical creatures with enormous enthusiasm. Younger students listened wide-eyed to his stories about Harry, Ron, and Hermione, while feeding nifflers or observing hippogriffs near the edge of the Forbidden Forest. The forest itself fascinated post-war students deeply. For Harry's generation, the Forbidden Forest often represented fear and danger. To younger students, it became almost legendary after hearing how centaurs and magical creatures helped defend Hogwarts against Voldemort's forces. Stories spread constantly about hidden battle sites deep beneath the trees, where giants once fought and acromantulas moved through darkness. At the same time, entirely new generations of students slowly entered the castle. Children born after Voldemort's fall grew up hearing stories about the war, much the way Harry's generation once heard stories about Grindelwald or older magical conflicts. To them, Harry Potter already seemed almost historical, despite still being alive and active inside the wizarding world. Eventually, the children of the war generation themselves arrived at Hogwarts. James Sirius Potter entered first, carrying both the Potter name and the restless confidence associated with the Weasley family through his mother, Ginny. Teachers quickly noticed similarities between James and his grandfather, James Potter, particularly his love of mischief and natural confidence moving through the castle. Later came Rose Granger Weasley, intelligent and determined much like Hermione. Hugo Weasley followed afterward with a gentler temperament that reminded some professors strongly of Ron beneath moments of humour. Yet perhaps the most closely watched arrival involved Albus Severus Potter and Scorpius Malfoy. The names alone carried enormous history inside Hogwarts walls. Many older witches and wizards expected the sons of Harry Potter and Draco Malfoy to inherit their father's rivalry automatically. Instead, something very different happened. Albus and Scorpius formed an unlikely friendship that confused and unsettled many adults still shaped by memories of the war. Scorpius especially struggled beneath expectations attached to his family name. Whispers followed him through Hogwarts corridors almost immediately after sorting. Some students feared him simply because he was a Malfoy. Others expected arrogance or cruelty that never truly appeared. In reality, Scorpius proved intelligent, awkward, thoughtful, and deeply lonely. beneath the weight of constant assumptions. Albus understood this isolation better than most. Being Harry Potter's son created pressures few classmates fully grasped. Students expected greatness from him automatically, simply because of his father's reputation. Teachers watched him carefully. Other children whispered constantly about whether he resembled Harry enough. The friendship between Albus and Scorpius represented something quietly important within post-war Hogwarts. It suggested that old divisions could weaken over time if younger generations refused inheriting every hatred passed down to them. Still, life at Hogwarts remained wonderfully ordinary in countless ways despite all its history. Students still rushed frantically to classes after oversleeping. Quidditch matches still filled the grounds with shouting crowds beneath cold autumn skies. Ghosts still drifted through corridors, complaining about Peeves. The enchanted ceiling still reflected thunderstorms, snowfall, and bright Scottish stars high above the Great Hall. The Hogwarts Express remained one of the strongest symbols of continuity. Every September 1st, families gathered once again at platform 9 3/4, surrounded by trunks, owls, and nervous excitement. Steam drifted across the platform exactly as it had for generations, while students prepared to leave ordinary life behind and enter the magical world waiting beyond the journey north. For parents like Harry, Hermione, Ron, and Ginny, watching their children board the train carried enormous emotional weight. They remembered their own first journeys to Hogwarts beneath very different circumstances. They remembered fear, prophecy, war, and uncertainty shaping their school years. Seeing their children laugh beside the scarlet train without carrying those same burdens felt almost unreal at times. The castle awaiting them beyond the Highlands still carried scars from the Battle of Hogwarts, but it also carried peace. That peace became perhaps the greatest achievement of the post-war generation. Not perfection, not the elimination of every prejudice or conflict, but the creation of a world where children could once again experience Hogwarts primarily as a school rather than a battlefield. Late at night, after students returned to dormitories and candles dimmed throughout the castle, Hogwarts itself seemed to settle into familiar rhythms once more. The staircases shifted softly through sleeping towers. The black lake reflected moonlight beyond quiet windows. Somewhere within the walls, portraits whispered to one another about generations passing through the castle's ancient halls. And beneath enchanted ceilings, older than memory itself, a new generation slowly began writing its own stories, far beyond the shadow of Voldemort's war. When Voldemort fell at Hogwarts, the shock of his defeat spread far beyond the borders of Britain. For years, much of the international wizarding world had watched events inside magical Britain with growing concern and uncertainty. Voldemort's influence extended farther than many British witches and wizards realized during the war itself. Foreign ministries monitored disappearances, suspicious magical activity, and increasingly unstable political conditions from a distance, fearing that the conflict might eventually spread across Europe and beyond. The defeat of Grindelwald decades earlier had taught magical governments an important lesson. Dark wizards rarely remained isolated to one country forever. During Voldemort's rise, several foreign ministries quietly strengthened magical border protections and increased surveillance of dark magical movements. International magical travel became more heavily monitored. Certain governments even warned citizens against unnecessary travel to Britain during the darkest period of the war. The British ministry's collapse beneath Voldemort's control deeply unsettled magical leaders worldwide. For centuries, the Ministry of Magic in London had stood among the most influential magical governments in Europe. Its corruption revealed how vulnerable even powerful institutions could become when fear spread slowly enough. Foreign officials worried privately that similar movements might already exist hidden within their own countries. As a result, Voldemort's defeat brought not only relief, but also caution. In the months following the Battle of Hogwarts, representatives from multiple magical governments arrived quietly in Britain. Some came publicly to restore diplomatic relations interrupted during the war. Others arrived more discreetly, hoping to better understand exactly how Voldemort had nearly succeeded in taking control of an entire magical society. Kingsley Shacklebolt handled many of these meetings personally after becoming Minister for Magic. Unlike some previous ministers, Kingsley believed strongly in international cooperation. The secrecy and denial surrounding Voldemort's return years earlier had allowed the situation to worsen dangerously. Now, magical governments across Europe began sharing information more openly regarding dark magical organizations, cursed artifacts, and extremist movements. The International Confederation of Wizards also became more active during this period. Though often criticized historically for moving slowly during crises, the Confederation recognized that Voldemort's war exposed weaknesses within global magical communication. Discussions about coordinated responses to future dark wizard threats increased significantly in the years after Hogwarts. At Beauxbatons Academy in France, students and professors followed news from Britain closely throughout the war and afterward. The elegant castle school, hidden within the Pyrenees Mountains, maintained long-standing connections with Hogwarts through academic exchanges and the Triwizard Tournament years earlier. During Voldemort's rise, Beauxbatons officials worried especially about the possibility of dark magical ideology spreading among younger witches and wizards across Europe. After the war, relationships between Beauxbatons and Hogwarts strengthened further. Student exchanges resumed more actively. Professors shared educational reforms related to teaching defensive magic and magical history more honestly. Older staff members at Beauxbatons sometimes spoke quietly about how close Europe came to another continent-wide magical conflict if Voldemort's influence had continued expanding unchecked. Durmstrang Institute remained more complicated. The Northern Magical School had long carried a reputation associated with harsh magical traditions and tolerance toward darker forms of magic. Grindelwald himself once attended Durmstrang before expulsion for dangerous experimentation. Though the school did not support Voldemort directly, many outsiders viewed its culture with suspicion after two major dark wizards emerged partly from its environment. In the years following Voldemort's defeat, Durmstrang faced increasing international pressure to distance itself more clearly from extremist ideologies. Some reforms occurred slowly inside the school, though secrecy surrounding Durmstrang made details difficult to confirm. Rumors continued circulating about students experimenting recklessly with dangerous magic in isolated northern regions far from ministry oversight. Even so, younger generations within Durmstrang increasingly rejected the old glorification of dark wizard power. Voldemort's destruction ultimately demonstrated where such obsessions led. Elsewhere across Europe, magical governments quietly reviewed their own vulnerabilities. Certain pure-blood movements in smaller countries lost influence rapidly after Voldemort's fall. Politicians and magical aristocrats who once admired aspects of his ideology suddenly distanced themselves from those beliefs publicly. Some magical communities held investigations into local supporters who had secretly communicated with Death Eaters during the war. Fear of similar uprisings lingered for years. In Eastern Europe especially, isolated magical settlements occasionally attracted rumors about dark magical groups attempting to reorganize after Voldemort's defeat. Aurors and international investigators monitored such reports carefully, though no threat ever approached Voldemort's level again. Meanwhile, ordinary witches and wizards outside Britain viewed Harry Potter with enormous fascination. For younger magical children in distant countries, Harry became almost legendary. Stories about the boy who survived Voldemort spread through magical schools across the world. Chocolate frog cards featuring Harry became even more popular internationally after the war. Some accounts exaggerated events wildly, turning battles and escapes into near mythological tales. Harry himself remained deeply uncomfortable with this fame, especially beyond Britain, where strangers often treated him less like a person and more like a living, historical figure. Still, his role in Voldemort's defeat shaped how much of the world viewed Britain afterward. Before the war ended, many magical governments considered Britain unstable and dangerous. Afterward, perceptions slowly shifted. Hogwarts surviving the battle became symbolic internationally. The image of students, teachers, centaurs, house elves, and ordinary citizens defending the castle together captured imaginations far beyond Scotland. Over time, Britain regained respect, not because it avoided darkness, but because it survived it. Magical travel gradually increased again during these peaceful years. Visiting families once hesitant to visit Britain returned to Diagon Alley, Hogsmeade, and historical magical sites connected to Harry Potter and the war. Some travelled simply out of curiosity. Others came seeking reassurance that Voldemort's influence had truly ended. Diagon Alley itself slowly regained an international atmosphere. Foreign magical languages drifted once more through crowded shops during summer months, before Hogwarts terms began. Owlpost routes connecting Britain with continental Europe expanded again after wartime restrictions ended. Wand makers, potions suppliers, and magical scholars resumed collaborations interrupted during the conflict. The Quidditch world also reflected these broader changes. International matches became important symbols of returning normalcy after the war. Teams traveling between countries represented peaceful cooperation rather than suspicion. Magical sporting events once again filled stadiums with cheering crowds rather than fearful security concerns. Ginny Weasley's later work as both Quidditch player and sports journalist brought her into contact with many international magical communities during this period. Through figures like her, younger generations of British witches and wizards became more connected globally than earlier generations shaped by isolation and war. At the same time, discussions about dark magic changed internationally. Before Voldemort's defeat, many magical governments treated dangerous magical research with varying degrees of secrecy or tolerance. After the war, there was greater recognition that dark magical ideology often spread quietly long before open violence appeared. Ministries began monitoring certain cursed artifacts and forbidden magical practices more carefully. The Department of Mysteries in Britain cooperated occasionally with foreign magical researchers studying defensive enchantments and magical containment systems. Though secrecy remained central to many magical institutions, the war encouraged somewhat greater information sharing regarding major threats. Even magical history education shifted in some countries. Voldemort's rise became a case study in how fear, prejudice, and political denial allowed darkness to grow gradually. Younger students across Europe learned more openly about both Voldemort and Grindelwald than previous generations had learned about older conflicts. Teachers increasingly emphasized the dangers of ignoring extremist magical movements simply because they appeared distant at first. Still, peace remained fragile in subtle ways. The wizarding world understood now that darkness rarely vanished forever. Small extremist groups occasionally appeared in isolated regions, claiming to continue pure-blood traditions or study forbidden magic secretly. Most remained insignificant, but governments monitored them carefully. Harry and other Aurors sometimes cooperated internationally during investigations involving escaped dark artifacts or suspected followers fleeing Britain after the war. Though these operations rarely became public knowledge, they reinforced growing cooperation between magical law enforcement agencies. Meanwhile, the wider magical world continued moving forward. Children attended magical schools without remembering Voldemort directly. Wand shops reopened fully. International owl post routes bustled with ordinary messages once again, rather than warnings and emergency notices. Wizarding musicians toured between magical capitals. Scholars resumed debates about magical theory instead of wartime survival. Late at night, in magical cities scattered across Europe, conversations about Britain slowly changed tone over the years. At first, people spoke about fear, then about relief, eventually about memory. The Battle of Hogwarts became part of modern magical history, studied by students who never experienced the war themselves. Harry Potter transformed gradually from current event into historical figure. Voldemort became a warning rather than an immediate threat. And somewhere far north in Scotland, Hogwarts itself continued standing above the Black Lake beneath drifting clouds and ancient towers, connected once again to a wider wizarding world, finally beginning to breathe peacefully after years of darkness. In the years after Voldemort's defeat, Hogwarts slowly entered a quieter age shaped not by legendary heroes, but by those who remained behind to guide the next generation. The professors who survived the war carried enormous responsibility upon their shoulders. They were no longer simply teachers preserving magical traditions. They had become witnesses to one of the darkest periods in modern wizarding history, and now they were responsible for helping the castle heal. At the center of this effort stood Minerva McGonagall. As headmistress, McGonagall inherited a Hogwarts profoundly different from the one she first served under Albus Dumbledore. The castle still stood proud above the Black Lake, but memories of the Battle of Hogwarts lingered in every tower and corridor. Students entering the school after the war looked to her not only for discipline and education, but also for reassurance that Hogwarts remained safe. McGonagall approached leadership with quiet determination. Unlike Dumbledore, she did not surround herself with mystery or grand plans hidden beneath layers of secrecy. Her strength came from steadiness. Students always knew where they stood with her. Rules mattered. Discipline mattered. Kindness mattered equally. In the aftermath of the war, these qualities became deeply important. Hogwarts needed stability more than spectacle. McGonagall spent long hours overseeing repairs to the castle, while simultaneously reorganizing the school's curriculum and staff structure. Some evenings, students spotted her walking through torchlit corridors alone long after curfew, inspecting repaired stonework or speaking quietly with portraits about the school's future. Age gradually slowed her physically over the years, but never diminished her presence. Inside the great hall, her voice still silenced entire tables instantly during feasts. First years entering Hogwarts often feared her at first glance, only to slowly discover the fierce loyalty and compassion beneath her strict exterior. Many younger students who never knew Dumbledore personally eventually viewed McGonagall herself as the defining face of Hogwarts. Professor Flitwick remained another constant presence during these years. Small in stature, but immensely respected, the charms professor continued teaching with enthusiasm well into old age. Students still crowded his classroom, learning levitation charms and defensive enchantments, while shelves overflowed with delicate magical instruments humming softly in the background. Flitwick carried his own memories of war quietly. Though cheerful by nature, he never entirely forgot dueling Death Eaters during the battle, or defending the castle beside former students. This gave additional seriousness to some of his later lessons. Younger students occasionally noticed how intensely he emphasized precision and control during defensive spell work. Still, his classroom remained one of the warmest places inside Hogwarts. Tiny, enchanted objects floated through the air, while Flitwick moved between desks, offering encouragement in his gentle voice. Many students considered him among the kindest professors in the school, especially those struggling to adjust during their first years. Professor Sprout also continued teaching for many years after the war. The greenhouses beneath her care became symbols of recovery in subtle ways. Plants damaged during the battle slowly regrew stronger than before. Magical vines climbed repaired walls, while the scent of damp soil and herbs drifted peacefully through glass corridors once shattered by curses. Sprout herself seemed perfectly suited to this period of rebuilding. Her calm practicality grounded students still carrying emotional wounds from the war. Lessons inside the greenhouses often felt strangely peaceful compared to the heavier atmosphere elsewhere in the castle. Students worked with living things, growing steadily, despite destruction, and that quiet symbolism mattered more than many realized at the time. Pomona Sprout also took special care of younger students who seemed frightened or withdrawn. Though not formally responsible for emotional healing, many children found comfort in her lessons among growing plants and warm greenhouse light. Rubeus Hagrid remained deeply beloved at Hogwarts throughout the post-war years. Though older now, he still moved across the grounds with enormous footsteps and booming enthusiasm. His hut beside the edge of the Forbidden Forest became one of the castle's most comforting places for many students. Smoke drifted constantly from the crooked chimney, while Fang dozed near the fire inside. Hagrid's role at Hogwarts evolved gradually after the war. He remained Care of Magical Creatures professor, though his lessons grew slightly less dangerous over time, after repeated concerns from staff about student safety. Even so, Hagrid never lost his fascination with creatures others considered terrifying. Students still found themselves unexpectedly face-to-face with blast-ended scroots, hippogriffs, or strange magical creatures Hagrid described as just misunderstood. For younger generations, Hagrid also became something almost legendary. Children arriving at Hogwarts heard endless stories connecting him to Harry Potter, the Battle of Hogwarts, and even the first rise of Voldemort decades earlier. Hagrid himself rarely spoke proudly about these events. Instead, he preferred discussing dragons, giant squid sightings, or interesting tracks discovered near the Forbidden Forest. Yet behind his warmth lingered grief that never disappeared entirely. Hagrid lost Dumbledore, whom he loved deeply, along with many others during the war. Sometimes late at night, students passing his hut spotted him sitting quietly outside, staring toward the castle beneath drifting lantern light. Professor Trelawney remained at Hogwarts as well, continuing her divination lessons high within the North Tower. Students still approached her classes with mixed reactions, exactly as before. Some considered divination fascinating, while others viewed it as hopelessly vague. Trelawney herself changed surprisingly little after the war. She still surrounded her classroom with perfumed smoke, delicate lamps, and mysterious fabrics fluttering softly in warm tower air. Yet those who knew the truth about her prophecy concerning Harry and Voldemort viewed her differently afterward. For years, many dismissed Sybil Trelawney as eccentric and unreliable. After Voldemort's defeat, however, the reality that one of her prophecies shaped the entire war became impossible to ignore completely. Even so, Trelawney continued living much as she always had. She predicted doom constantly. She startled students dramatically during tea leaf readings. She wandered the corridors, muttering vague warnings, while balancing enormous stacks of shawls and crystal balls. In some strange way, her continued presence reassured Hogwarts itself remained familiar, despite everything that changed. Horace Slughorn also survived the war and remained connected to Hogwarts for a period afterward. Slughorn represented a more complicated figure than many professors. His vanity and love of influence never vanished entirely, yet his bravery during the Battle of Hogwarts earned genuine respect. He duelled Voldemort himself alongside McGonagall and Kingsley during the final stages of the battle. Afterward, Slughorn continued teaching potions, with his usual mixture of theatrical charm and selective favoritism. Students still competed fiercely for invitations into his slug club gatherings. Candied pineapple and comfortable armchairs still filled his office during evening conversations with promising young witches and wizards. Yet beneath his cheerful personality lingered deep regret over the memory of Tom Riddle and the Horcrux conversation that haunted him permanently. Slughorn became noticeably more careful in later years regarding ambitious students fascinated by power. Perhaps most haunting of all within Hogwarts were the portraits hanging inside the headmaster's office. After the war, Severus Snape's portrait did not appear immediately, because Snape abandoned the post before dying during the Battle of Hogwarts. Tradition technically complicated whether his portrait belonged among previous headmasters. Yet over time, pressure from Harry Potter and others ensured Snape eventually received a place within the office. The debate surrounding Snape's legacy remained deeply divided for many years. Some viewed him as a cruel teacher whose bitterness damaged generations of students. Others saw him as one of the bravest spies in wizarding history, sacrificing nearly everything in service of Dumbledore's plans. The truth, as always with Snape, remained painfully complicated. Students entering the headmaster's office generations later often noticed his portrait sitting apart from some others, watching conversations silently with unreadable expression. Portraits within Hogwarts retained much of the personality and memory of those they represented, and Snape's image remained exactly as difficult and guarded as the man himself had been. Dumbledore's portrait, meanwhile, continued offering occasional guidance from the wall behind the headmaster's desk. Though no longer alive, his presence remained deeply woven into Hogwarts. McGonagall sometimes spoke quietly with the portrait late at night, regarding difficult decisions. Harry visited occasionally during later years, finding strange comfort in conversations beneath the office's circular windows. The office itself changed little over time. Silver instruments still whirred softly on tables. Fawkes's old perch remained empty after the Phoenix departed following Dumbledore's death. The sorting hat still rested quietly upon its shelf between ceremonies. Throughout all these years, Hogwarts slowly passed from one generation into another. Older professors gradually retired or died peacefully after long lives devoted to the school. Younger teachers arrived carrying different perspectives, shaped by surviving Voldemort's war. The castle adapted continuously, while still remaining unmistakably Hogwarts. Students continued filling the corridors with laughter and arguments beneath shifting staircases. Quills scratched across parchment inside classrooms, warmed by magical firelight. Snow still gathered along the towers during winter, while the Black Lake darkened beneath cold evening skies. Yet beneath these ordinary rhythms, the castle itself carried memory. Every professor who survived the war understood this deeply. They taught not merely spells and magical theory, but the responsibility of preserving a better future than the one Voldemort nearly created. Late at night, after students returned to dormitories and the corridors fell silent, Hogwarts often seemed older than any living witch or wizard could fully comprehend. Candles flickered beside ancient stone, while portraits whispered softly among themselves about centuries of students now gone. And somewhere high above the sleeping castle, beneath enchanted ceilings reflecting endless stars, the surviving generation of professors quietly guarded the fragile peace they had fought so hard to preserve. Even after Voldemort's death, the wizarding world did not become peaceful overnight. Though the Battle of Hogwarts marked the end of open war, many dangers still remained hidden throughout magical Britain. Surviving Death Eaters fled into forests, abandoned estates, and isolated magical communities. Dark magical artifacts remained scattered across the country. Fear lingered among ordinary witches and wizards who worried that another movement might someday rise from the ruins left behind. For the Auror office, the years following the war became a long and exhausting period of pursuit and vigilance. The Ministry of Magic understood immediately that allowing Voldemort's remaining followers to disappear completely would create enormous risk in the future. Some Death Eaters surrendered after the battle, realizing their cause had collapsed beyond recovery. Others attempted escape almost immediately once Voldemort fell. Many vanished into hiding, using old family connections and secret safe houses prepared during the war. Auror teams spent months tracking these fugitives across Britain. Harry Potter and Ron Weasley became central figures in many early investigations. Though both remained very young, their experiences during the war gave them unusual understanding of how Voldemort's followers operated. Harry especially possessed instincts shaped by years spent surviving against dark wizards under constantly changing conditions. Unlike older Aurors trained entirely within ministry structures, Harry understood how fear and secrecy allowed darkness to spread quietly beneath official systems. The atmosphere inside the Auror office during these years remained tense and heavily disciplined. Long hours became normal. Reports arrived constantly regarding suspicious magical activity or rumors of hidden Death Eaters. Entire investigation teams formed around locating dangerous magical artifacts abandoned after Voldemort's fall. Some discoveries proved deeply disturbing. Several pure-blood estates contained hidden rooms filled with cursed objects and forbidden magical texts accumulated over generations. Dark potions laboratories appeared beneath abandoned buildings in remote countryside areas. One investigation uncovered enchanted masks and robes, hidden beneath a seemingly ordinary wizarding antiques shop in Nocturne Alley. Many objects connected to Voldemort's regime carried lingering traces of dark magic even years after the war ended. The Ministry established special containment vaults for certain confiscated artifacts, too dangerous to destroy immediately. Curse breakers, magical historians, and unspeakables from the Department of Mysteries occasionally assisted Aurors when handling especially unstable items. Harry insisted repeatedly that dangerous magical objects should never be underestimated. His experiences with Horcruxes shaped much of his thinking during these years. He understood how seemingly ordinary objects could carry terrible influence when dark magic attached itself deeply enough. Younger Aurors often noticed how cautious Harry became whenever investigations involved enchanted items rather than direct combat. Meanwhile, surviving Death Eaters adapted to life on the run in different ways. Some fled Britain entirely, using illegal portkeys or hidden magical routes connected to foreign magical communities. Others attempted blending quietly back into ordinary wizarding society under false identities. A small number remained fanatically loyal to Voldemort even after his death, refusing to believe he could truly be gone forever. These fanatics worried the Ministry most. Several isolated attacks occurred during the years immediately following the war. most remained small compared to Voldemort's earlier terror, but they reminded magical Britain how fragile peace still remained. Aurors occasionally discovered graffiti supporting blood purity ideology inside magical villages, or intercepted illegal gatherings where former followers discussed preserving Voldemort's beliefs. Though these groups lacked Voldemort's power and leadership, the Ministry refused ignoring them. Harry supported this approach strongly. One of the greatest failures during Voldemort's original rise involved widespread denial. Too many people dismissed warning signs until violence became impossible to avoid. Harry encouraged younger Aurors to investigate suspicious activity seriously, even when evidence initially seemed minor. His reputation inside the Auror office grew steadily during these years. Older Aurors respected his practical experience, while younger recruits often admired him almost excessively. Harry himself disliked being treated like a legend during ordinary investigations. He preferred quiet efficiency over attention, and remained uncomfortable whenever reporters attempted following Ministry operations involving him. Still, his presence reassured ordinary citizens enormously. Witches and wizards, who once feared leaving their homes during Voldemort's reign, now saw Harry helping protect the recovering magical world openly. This mattered psychologically, even beyond his actual investigative work. Ron also developed into a capable Auror during this period, though his strengths differed significantly from Harry's. Ron understood people naturally, and often noticed emotional tensions others overlooked. During interrogations or witness interviews, he frequently recognized fear, dishonesty, or desperation more quickly than expected. The partnership between Harry and Ron remained effective partly because of these differences. Yet despite successes, Auror work after the war carried emotional strain difficult to escape. Many investigations forced survivors to revisit places connected directly to Voldemort's violence. Aurors entered abandoned homes where entire families disappeared during the war. They discovered hidden torture chambers beneath old estates. Some safe houses still contained evidence of prisoners held during the conflict. These experiences affected Harry deeply at times. Though outwardly calm during operations, certain cases brought memories rushing back unexpectedly. The smell of damp stone inside underground chambers sometimes reminded him of Malfoy Manor. Certain curses heard during duels triggered memories of the Department of Mysteries, or the graveyard in Little Hangleton. Years after Voldemort's defeat, Harry still carried the war within him quietly. Kingsley Shacklebolt understood this better than many Ministry officials. As Minister for Magic, Kingsley worked closely with the Auror office during reconstruction efforts, while also pushing broader reforms across magical law enforcement. He believed strongly that the Ministry needed not only stronger security, but wiser leadership than existed before Voldemort's rise. Auror training changed significantly during these years. Before the war, some aspects of magical law enforcement became rigid and overly dependent on Ministry authority itself. Voldemort's infiltration exposed how dangerous that complacency could become. New training programs emphasized adaptability, ethical judgment, and cooperation rather than blind obedience. Defensive magic instruction expanded considerably as well. Young Aurors studied the Battle of Hogwarts almost like military history. Lessons examined how resistance groups organized secretly beneath Voldemort's regime, how magical communities protected vulnerable populations, and how dark magical movements manipulated fear politically. The goal was not simply preparing Aurors to fight dark wizards. It was preparing them to recognize darkness before it consumed society again. Azkaban also changed slowly during this period. For centuries, Dementors guarded the prison, feeding upon despair while keeping inmates emotionally broken. After Voldemort's fall, however, reliance upon Dementors became increasingly controversial. Their alliance with Voldemort during the war proved how unstable and dangerous such creatures truly were. Kingsley gradually reduced Dementor involvement in prison security. New magical protections strengthened Azkaban's defenses, while trained personnel replaced some traditional methods. Though the prison remained isolated and grim upon its cold northern island, conditions changed somewhat over time. Even so, Azkaban still haunted the wizarding imagination. The prison symbolized lingering fears that dark wizards could rise again if vigilance weakened. Older witches and wizards remembered too clearly how many Death Eaters escaped during Voldemort's first reign of terror. Meanwhile, investigations into dark magical networks occasionally extended beyond Britain itself. Harry and select Aurors cooperated at times with foreign magical governments, tracking smuggling operations involving cursed objects or fugitives fleeing abroad. Though most missions remained secret from the public, international cooperation increased significantly after the war. Magical Britain no longer wished facing darkness alone. Over time, however, the intensity of these operations slowly lessened. Most surviving Death Eaters were eventually captured, imprisoned, or reduced to isolated remnants lacking real influence. Illegal dark magical markets shrank under ministry pressure. Ordinary magical life returned more fully each year. Harry eventually rose to become head of the Auror office itself. The position suited him better than many expected. Though never naturally political, Harry led through experience, honesty, and trust earned rather than demanded. Younger Aurors viewed him as someone who understood the cost of failure personally. Yet even after reaching such high rank, Harry never entirely relaxed. Part of him remained permanently alert for signs of returning darkness. He knew too well that evil rarely announced itself openly at first. It spread quietly through fear, prejudice, and silence long before battles ever began. Late at night inside the ministry, long after most offices emptied, Aurors still patrolled dim corridors beneath enchanted ceilings, while reports drifted between departments as folded paper airplanes. Magical maps flickered softly within investigation rooms tracking unresolved cases. Somewhere inside secure vaults, dangerous artifacts remained locked away behind layers of protective enchantments. The war might have ended, but memory remained. For Harry and the Aurors, who rebuilt magical law enforcement afterward, peace was never something guaranteed permanently. It required attention, responsibility, vigilance. And so, while Hogwarts returned to teaching children beneath floating candles, and Diagon Alley filled once more with laughter and crowded shops, another quieter battle continued in the background. Not a war for survival this time, but a long effort to ensure the darkness that nearly destroyed the wizarding world would never rise so easily again. Few figures in modern wizarding history remained as deeply misunderstood after the war as Severus Snape. In the immediate aftermath of Voldemort's defeat, much of magical Britain remembered him only as the man who killed Albus Dumbledore and served as headmaster during the darkest year in Hogwarts history. Students who suffered beneath the Carrows associated Snape's rule with fear, punishment, and silence. Many Order members distrusted him even after his death, because they never learned the full truth. For a time, Severus Snape's name carried almost no honor at all. Inside Hogwarts, reactions to his death remained deeply divided. Some students quietly celebrated the fall of a teacher they viewed as cruel and unfair. Others remembered moments where Snape's actions seemed strangely protective despite his harshness. Most simply remained confused. Only a very small number of people understood what Severus Snape had truly done. Harry Potter became the most important among them. After viewing Snape's memories inside the pensive shortly before Voldemort's final defeat, Harry carried knowledge that transformed everything he believed about the potions master. The man Harry spent years distrusting and often hating had secretly protected him for nearly his entire life. Snape's loyalty to Dumbledore, his love for Lily Potter, and his role as a spy within Voldemort's inner circle revealed a level of sacrifice almost impossible for outsiders to fully comprehend. Yet understanding Snape did not erase the pain he caused. This complexity shaped nearly every later discussion about his legacy. When the war ended, Harry faced difficult decisions regarding how much truth to reveal publicly. Certain details surrounding Snape's role remained deeply sensitive, particularly aspects involving Dumbledore's planned death and the Elder Wand. Still, Harry believed strongly that the wizarding world deserved to know Snape had not truly betrayed Hogwarts. Gradually, the truth emerged. Kingsley Shacklebolt and several surviving members of the Order quietly confirmed Snape's role as Dumbledore's agent during the war. Information spread carefully through the Ministry, Hogwarts, and eventually the broader wizarding public. Many people reacted with disbelief at first. Some refused accepting it entirely. To those who suffered under Snape as students, the idea of him secretly serving the light felt impossible to reconcile with the bitterness and cruelty they remembered. Neville Longbottom, for example, carried painful memories of Snape long after the war, despite later understanding his sacrifices. Others, however, viewed Snape differently once the full story emerged. Former Order members reflected upon the immense danger he faced living for years beneath Voldemort's suspicion. Aurors studying the war recognized how much information Snape secretly passed to Dumbledore at enormous personal risk. Historians later concluded that Voldemort's defeat likely would not have been possible without Snape maintaining his role inside the Death Eater ranks for so long. At Hogwarts, the debate surrounding Snape became almost permanent. Students entering the school after the war encountered conflicting stories immediately. Older professors described him as brave but deeply troubled. Portraits whispered different opinions depending on who spoke. Some students admired his courage, while others focused on his cruelty inside classrooms. This uncertainty fascinated younger generations. Severus Snape did not fit neatly into the categories Hogwarts students preferred. He was not purely heroic like many imagined Harry Potter to be, nor was he simply evil like Bellatrix Lestrange or Voldemort. Instead, Snape existed somewhere painfully in between. The castle itself seemed uncertain how to remember him. For a time, his portrait did not hang inside the headmaster's office alongside former Hogwarts leaders. Because Snape abandoned the school before dying during the battle, some argued tradition technically prevented his inclusion. Others believed refusing him a portrait ignored his sacrifices entirely. Harry strongly disagreed with leaving Snape absent. Over time, his influence alongside McGonagall's support ensured Snape eventually received his rightful place among the portraits of former headmasters. Students visiting the office afterward often noticed Snape's portrait sitting quietly apart from others, observing conversations with his familiar guarded expression. Even in portrait form, he rarely spoke more than necessary. Yet those who spent enough time inside the office occasionally witnessed moments revealing traces of the man behind the cold exterior. Some evenings, Dumbledore's portrait and Snape's portrait argued softly across the walls, like echoes of old conversations interrupted by death itself. Harry's own feelings towards Snape remained complicated throughout adulthood. Understanding the truth did not erase years of humiliation and hostility at Hogwarts. Harry still remembered Snape insulting him during lessons, favouring Slytherins unfairly, and punishing students harshly. Yet he also understood now that Snape carried burdens and pain few people could have endured without breaking entirely. Most importantly, Harry recognized that Snape chose repeatedly to protect others, despite receiving almost no love or gratitude in return. That mattered deeply to him. When Harry later named his second son Albus Severus Potter, the decision surprised much of the wizarding world. Some criticized it openly, unable to understand honoring a man remembered as cruel and bitter. Yet to Harry, the name reflected something important about courage and redemption. Years later at King's Cross Station, Harry explained this quietly to young Albus before Hogwarts. "You were named for 2 headmasters of Hogwarts," he told him. "One of them was a Slytherin, and he was probably the bravest man I ever knew." That sentence shaped how later generations viewed Snape, perhaps more than anything else. At Hogwarts, younger students grew increasingly fascinated by the contradictions surrounding him. Some saw him as tragic, others viewed him as heroic. A few focused primarily on his flaws. Entire essays in magical history classes debated whether Severus Snape should be remembered as victim, villain, or savior. The answer never remained simple. His childhood at Spinner's End added another layer to his story, once details became more widely known. Students learned about the lonely boy, growing up beside neglect and bitterness, long before arriving at Hogwarts. They learned about Lily Evans, whose friendship became perhaps the only source of warmth in his early life. They learned how fear, jealousy, and obsession slowly pulled him toward darker influences before Voldemort's rise fully consumed him. For many students, this made Snape frighteningly human, unlike Voldemort, who often seemed almost inhuman in his cruelty. Snape represented how ordinary pain and resentment could slowly twist someone into bitterness. Yet he also represented the possibility that a person could still choose sacrifice despite years of mistakes. Teachers at Hogwarts struggled sometimes with how openly to discuss him. McGonagall usually spoke about Snape with measured respect rather than affection. Slughorn remembered him as one of the most gifted potion students Hogwarts ever produced. Former Slytherins often defended him more strongly than students from other houses. Neville Longbottom remained among the most complex voices regarding Snape. As a student, Neville feared Snape more than almost anyone. Yet later, as herbology professor at Hogwarts himself, Neville also came to understand the immense pressure and emotional damage many adults carried during Voldemort's reign. Though he never forgot the fear Snape caused him, maturity softened some of his anger over time. Snape's legacy also influenced Slytherin House significantly after the war. For generations, Slytherin struggled beneath associations with dark wizards and blood supremacy ideology. Snape complicated that narrative enormously. He embodied both the dangers of bitterness and the possibility of redemption emerging from darkness itself. Students from Slytherin increasingly pointed towards Snape as proof their house could not simply be reduced to villains and heroes divided neatly apart. Meanwhile, magical scholars later studied Snape's magical abilities with enormous respect. His skill in potion making, occlumency, and spell invention ranked among the finest of his era. Certain spells and potion modifications he created eventually entered broader magical study, despite discomfort surrounding their creator. Even Harry occasionally found himself thinking about Snape unexpectedly during quiet moments later in life, sometimes while walking through Hogwarts corridors, sometimes while watching Albus grow older, sometimes while remembering the strange sadness inside Snape's memories, viewed through the pensieve. Harry understood perhaps better than anyone that Severus Snape never truly found peace while alive. His entire adult life revolved around grief, secrecy, guilt, and dangerous loyalty. He protected the son of the man he hated because he loved the boy's mother beyond death itself. He lived surrounded by people who distrusted or misunderstood him almost completely. Even his greatest acts of bravery remained hidden until after he died, and yet he continued anyway. Late at night, inside Hogwarts, long after students returned to dormitories and candlelight dimmed beneath enchanted ceilings, Snape's portrait sometimes sat silently within the headmaster's office, listening to the castle around him. The same corridors where he once stalked angrily as potions master now filled with younger generations carrying only fragments of his story. Some remembered him cruelly, some sympathetically, most uncertainly. Perhaps that uncertainty itself became the truest reflection of Severus Snape. Not a perfect hero, not a simple villain, but a deeply wounded man who made terrible mistakes, carried unbearable regrets, and still chose in the end to stand against darkness, even when nobody would ever fully understand the cost. As the years passed after Voldemort's defeat, the wizarding world slowly began rediscovering something many people had nearly forgotten how to experience: ordinary life. For an entire generation, fear had shaped daily existence in ways both large and small. Families whispered conversations behind closed doors. Owls arriving late at night carried dread rather than comfort. Parents worried constantly about children traveling alone. Shopkeepers watched crowded streets nervously for signs of Death Eaters or ministry patrols. After the war, those fears faded gradually, rather than disappearing all at once. The first signs of peace appeared quietly. In Diagon Alley, shops that once closed early during Voldemort's rise began remaining open later into the evening again. Lanterns glowed warmly across the cobbled street, while witches and wizards wandered between storefronts without rushing home before dark. Children pressed faces against the windows of quality Quidditch supplies and Weasley's wizard wheezes, while parents spoke calmly nearby. The atmosphere changed slowly from tension into ordinary noise. Laughter returned first. During the war years, even crowded magical places often felt subdued. Conversations stayed careful and quiet, because nobody knew who might be listening. After Voldemort's fall, that caution gradually weakened. Street musicians reappeared in magical markets. Public celebrations became more common. Wizarding families once again travelled openly between villages and cities without constant fear. Hogsmeade reflected this transformation especially well. The small village beside Hogwarts carried painful memories after the war. Death Eaters once patrolled its streets. Residents hid students fleeing capture during Voldemort's control of the Ministry. The Hog's Head served as a secret refuge beneath an atmosphere of suspicion and danger. Yet over time, Hogsmeade became peaceful again. Students filled the village on weekends exactly as they had for generations before the war. Honeydukes overflowed with excited children, buying sweets before returning to Hogwarts. Warm lights shone from the windows of the Three Broomsticks, while snow drifted softly across rooftops during winter evenings. The village still remembered the war, but no longer lived inside it. Across magical Britain, families rebuilt homes damaged or abandoned during the conflict. Some repaired physical destruction left by raids and battles. Others rebuilt emotionally after losing loved ones. The process varied enormously from family to family. Certain wounds healed slowly. There were still empty seats at dinner tables throughout the wizarding world. Memorials remained in magical villages, honoring those who died fighting Voldemort. Some survivors carried permanent injuries from dark magic, or battle scars impossible to erase completely. Even so, younger generations growing up after the war experienced life differently. Children born in the peaceful years following Voldemort's fall did not understand fear the same way their parents did. They heard stories about Death Eaters and the Battle of Hogwarts, much like earlier generations heard stories about Grindelwald or ancient goblin rebellions. To them, the war already felt distant and historical, despite how recently it ended. This shift changed magical society deeply. For perhaps the first time in many decades, children entered Hogwarts without growing up beneath the shadow of an active dark wizard. They worried about homework, Quidditch tryouts, and house rivalries, rather than disappearances and ministry corruption. Parents noticed the difference immediately. Harry Potter often watched his own children interacting with friends, and felt quietly astonished by how ordinary their concerns seemed compared to his own childhood. Ginny noticed it too during conversations with younger Hogwarts students while working as a Quidditch journalist. Peace itself became normal again. This change affected social attitudes throughout magical Britain as well. Before the war, blood purity prejudice lingered openly within many parts of wizarding society. Certain families viewed Muggle-born witches and wizards with suspicion or superiority almost automatically. Voldemort's rise weaponized those beliefs into violence and political persecution. After witnessing where such ideology ultimately led, many people rejected it far more strongly than before. The Ministry's legal reforms under Kingsley Shacklebolt and later Hermione Granger reinforced these changes steadily. Laws protecting Muggle-born rights strengthened. Open discrimination became far less socially acceptable in public life. Younger witches and wizards increasingly viewed blood status as irrelevant compared to older generations shaped by pure blood traditions. This transformation happened gradually rather than perfectly. Prejudice did not disappear entirely from magical Britain after Voldemort's death. Some older families still clung quietly to ideas about blood purity and magical superiority. Small extremist groups occasionally surfaced promoting old ideologies, yet they no longer held the same influence they once did. The broader culture shifted away from them. At Hogwarts, friendships between students from different backgrounds became increasingly common after the war. Younger generations carried fewer assumptions about pure-blood identity than many parents once did. Children growing up in peaceful years questioned older prejudices more naturally because they lacked direct memory of the fear that fueled them originally. Even Slytherin House slowly changed under this new atmosphere. Meanwhile, magical businesses flourished again. Diagon Alley expanded gradually as confidence returned to the economy. New shops opened beside old family businesses. Wand makers, potion suppliers, and magical bookstores once again focused more on innovation than survival. International magical trade resumed fully after wartime disruptions ended. The Daily Prophet also reflected the changing atmosphere of magical Britain. Though still imperfect, the newspaper shifted away from the fear-driven reporting that defined Voldemort's rise. Articles increasingly focused on Quidditch matches, magical discoveries, school events, and ordinary community life, rather than constant political crisis. Magical entertainment thrived during these years too. Wizarding musicians toured across Britain and Europe. Public magical festivals returned to villages that suspended celebrations during the war. Quidditch stadiums filled once more with cheering crowds beneath enchanted lights. For many people, these ordinary joys carried enormous emotional importance precisely because they once seemed impossible. Even simple things like crowded cafes or children laughing openly in public felt meaningful to those who survived Voldemort's reign. The relationship between the magical and Muggle worlds also stabilized significantly after the war. Though secrecy remained essential under the Statute of Secrecy, the Ministry became somewhat more thoughtful, regarding how magical events affected Muggle communities indirectly. Voldemort's violence caused disturbances that occasionally spilled dangerously close to non-magical awareness during the conflict. Post-war governments worked more carefully to prevent such instability from happening again. Arthur Weasley especially appreciated many of these quieter changes. The magical world he always hoped for, curious, open-minded, and less fearful of differences, slowly became more possible after Voldemort's defeat. At the same time, older generations who survived the war often developed stronger appreciation for ordinary life itself. Molly Weasley treasured family dinners even more intensely after losing Fred. Harry valued peaceful mornings with Ginny and their children because he spent so many years believing he might never live long enough to experience them. Hermione worked tirelessly within the Ministry precisely because she wanted younger generations growing up after the war to inherit something better. The castle of Hogwarts reflected these broader societal changes quietly. Students still studied magical history and learned about Voldemort's rise, but they no longer lived expecting another war immediately around the corner. The Great Hall, once again, became primarily a place for feasts, announcements, and ordinary student life rather than shelter during battle. The wizarding world began allowing itself to imagine long-term futures again. Young witches and wizards pursued careers, relationships, and ambitions without constant interruption from political chaos. Families planned years ahead rather than simply surviving month to month. Magical scholars focused once more on discovery and learning rather than defense against dark magic. Late in the evenings, magical Britain slowly settled into peaceful rhythms forgotten during the war. Lights glowed warmly through the windows of wizarding homes hidden across countryside valleys and magical villages. Owls carried ordinary letters between friends and families. The Ministry corridors grew quiet after workdays ended without emergency alarms echoing through the building. Even Azkaban seemed more distant from daily life than before. The world remained imperfect, of course. Arguments still occurred inside the Ministry. Hogwarts students still broke rules constantly. Quidditch fans still shouted fiercely about referee decisions and team rivalries. Wizards still made mistakes, acted selfishly, or disagreed bitterly. But these were ordinary problems, not the shadows of war. And that distinction mattered deeply. The greatest victory after Voldemort's defeat was not simply survival. It was the return of ordinary magical life. The return of children growing up without terror shaping every memory. The return of futures built upon possibility rather than fear. For the generation that survived the war, peace sometimes felt fragile, even many years later. Yet gradually, almost without noticing, magical Britain learned how to live normally again. Candles floated above family dinners. Students hurried laughing through Hogwarts corridors. Shopkeepers opened windows each morning without fear. And beneath drifting clouds above the ancient castle, a new generation inherited a world finally beginning to believe that darkness did not always have to return. 19 years after the Battle of Hogwarts, the wizarding world had become quieter than anyone from Harry Potter's generation once believed possible. The scars of war still existed beneath the surface of magical Britain, but they no longer defined everyday life. Children born after Voldemort's fall now filled Hogwarts with ordinary worries about classes, friendships, Quidditch, and house rivalries, rather than fear of dark wizards. And on a cool September morning, beneath drifting steam and crowded voices, another generation prepared to board the Hogwarts Express. Platform 9 3/4 looked much the same as it always had. Scarlet train cars gleamed beneath white clouds of steam, while owls hooted impatiently from cages stacked beside trunks. Parents hurried through the crowd, calling last-minute reminders to children already half distracted by excitement. Young students clutched tickets tightly, while older ones greeted friends loudly after long summers apart. The platform carried an atmosphere of movement and continuity that seemed almost untouched by time. Yet for Harry Potter, standing there beside Ginny and their children, the morning carried deeper emotion than he often allowed himself to express openly. 19 years earlier, he had stood inside Hogwarts, watching Voldemort's body collapse onto the stone floor of the Great Hall. At that moment, Harry could not imagine reaching adulthood peacefully, let alone standing on a train platform preparing to send his own children to school. Now James Sirius Potter moved confidently through the crowd, ahead of everyone else, already eager to return to Hogwarts. Lily Luna Potter remained younger still, disappointed she could not yet board the train herself. And between them stood Albus Severus Potter, nervous in ways Harry recognized immediately. The fear in Albus reminded Harry painfully of his own first journey to Hogwarts. Not fear of danger this time, but fear of belonging. The wizarding world around them had changed enormously since the war, but certain anxieties remained timeless for children approaching Hogwarts for the first time. Albus worried constantly about sorting, expectations, and the enormous weight attached to his family name. Everywhere he went, people recognized him as Harry Potter's son. To adults, this often seemed exciting. To Albus, it felt overwhelming. Meanwhile, nearby, Ron and Hermione stood with Rose and Hugo Weasley. Ron still spoke loudly enough to attract attention from half the platform, while Hermione repeatedly adjusted details on Rose's robes, despite everything already appearing perfectly organized. The familiar warmth of the Weasley family surrounded the platform exactly as it had during Harry's own childhood. Only now they were the parents. This realization struck Harry often during moments like these. Time had moved quietly forward, while the generation that once fought Voldemort slowly became older, steadier, and more reflective than they ever expected. Across the platform, Draco Malfoy stood beside his son Scorpius. The sight still felt strange sometimes, even after all the years since the war. Draco looked older and calmer than the sharp-faced boy Harry remembered from Hogwarts corridors. The bitterness and arrogance that once defined him had softened considerably with age and experience. Scorpius himself appeared nervous in an entirely different way from Albus. Tall, pale, and awkwardly polite, he attracted curious stares from surrounding families because of the Malfoy name attached to him. Yet unlike his father during childhood, Scorpius carried little confidence beneath the attention. Harry noticed immediately how isolated the boy seemed standing among other children. The friendship that later developed between Albus and Scorpius surprised much of the wizarding world for exactly this reason. People expected history to repeat itself automatically, but younger generations often inherited less hatred than older ones feared. As the Hogwarts Express released another great cloud of steam into the air, Harry found himself reflecting quietly upon everything that changed since the war. Around him stood people who survived impossible things together. Ron, Hermione, Ginny, Draco. They all carried memories of Voldemort's rise, the Battle of Hogwarts, and the years shaped by fear. Yet the children surrounding them carried none of that weight directly. That difference mattered deeply. The platform itself symbolized continuity within the wizarding world, perhaps more than any other place. Generations of students passed through it, carrying trunks, owls, fears, ambitions, and hopes toward Hogwarts. Wars came and went, ministers changed, dark wizards rose and fell. Still, the Scarlet Train continued arriving every September. first beneath drifting steam and enchanted barriers hidden from Muggle eyes. Harry watched Albus nervously studying the students around him, particularly those discussing Slytherin House nearby. The fear finally emerged quietly. What if I'm in Slytherin? For a moment, Harry saw not only his son standing before him, but also the frightened 11-year-old version of himself listening to Draco Malfoy on the Hogwarts Express so many years earlier. House identity once felt enormously important during Harry's childhood because the war itself divided Hogwarts so sharply. Now, however, Harry understood things differently. He told Albus something that represented perhaps the deepest lesson learned after Voldemort's fall. It is our choices, Harry, that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities. Dumbledore's words echoed through Harry's memory, even years later. So he reassured Albus quietly that Slytherin House did not define goodness or evil. He explained that Albus Severus was named partly after a Slytherin who proved extraordinarily brave. Most importantly, Harry reminded him that choice mattered more than destiny. For the generation born after the war, this became one of the central truths inherited from those who survived it. The train whistle sounded across the platform. Students began climbing aboard, while parents called final goodbyes through open windows. Owls fluttered inside cages. Trunks bumped against narrow train corridors. Somewhere farther down the platform, laughter erupted as Fred and George's old joke products exploded unexpectedly inside someone's luggage. The ordinary chaos felt comforting. As the train slowly began moving, Harry caught glimpses of younger faces pressed against windows with excitement shining in their eyes. They looked toward Hogwarts, not as a battlefield or symbol of resistance, but as a school filled with possibility. That simple difference represented the true healing of the wizarding world. Teddy Lupin also appeared briefly during these moments, older now and standing beside Victoire Weasley with easy affection. For Harry, seeing Teddy grown nearly into adulthood carried emotional weight difficult to describe. Remus Lupin and Tonks died during the Battle of Hogwarts, believing their son would grow up orphaned because of war. Now Teddy stood alive within a peaceful world they never lived long enough to witness. The train disappeared gradually into the distance beneath pale autumn light. Parents lingered on the platform afterward, speaking quietly while steam drifted through the thinning crowd. Some conversations turned toward ministry work, Quidditch, or family life. Others simply enjoyed the strange calm of ordinary routine, returning year after year. For Harry and his generation, these moments still felt almost unreal sometimes. They remembered too clearly how close everything came to destruction. Voldemort's shadow no longer ruled magical Britain, but traces of the past remained visible beneath peaceful surfaces. Memorials still stood at Hogwarts. Survivors still carried scars. Some nights, Harry still dreamed about the Forbidden Forest or the Great Hall after battle. Yet standing on platform 9 3/4, watching the Hogwarts Express carry another generation safely northward, reminded him why all of it mattered. The war had not ended, simply so heroes could survive. It ended so children could inherit ordinary futures. Late in the afternoon, after the platform emptied almost completely, Harry often found himself lingering a little longer than necessary before leaving. The silence following the train's departure carried strange echoes of memory. Somewhere far away beyond hills and lakes, Hogwarts waited once again for another year of students beneath ancient towers and enchanted ceilings. The castle still remembered every generation that passed through its halls. It remembered Tom Riddle walking its corridors long before becoming Voldemort. It remembered Dumbledore teaching beneath floating candles. It remembered Harry, Ron, and Hermione racing through hidden passages during the war. Now it waited for Albus, Rose, Scorpius, and countless others who would shape the future in quieter ways. As Harry finally turned away from the empty platform beside Ginny, he realized something he could never fully understand during his childhood. Peace was not loud. It was not dramatic like prophecy or battle or legend. Sometimes peace looked simply like children boarding a train without fear, while parents watched them disappear toward Hogwarts beneath drifting steam and an autumn sky. Long after the Battle of Hogwarts ended, the wizarding world continued living beneath its shadow in quiet ways. The war became history slowly, passing from memory into story, as younger generations grew up hearing about Voldemort in classrooms rather than fearing him in daily life. Yet the events of that final battle never disappeared entirely from magical Britain. They shaped laws, families, schools, friendships, and even the way people understood courage itself. Hogwarts stood at the center of all those memories. The ancient castle, beside the Black Lake, had survived centuries of magical history before Voldemort's rise, but the battle transformed it permanently into something more than simply a school. For those who fought there, Hogwarts became sacred ground. Every corridor carried echoes of footsteps and spells from that terrible night. Every tower seemed to remember the students and teachers who defended it together, beneath falling stone and green light. Visitors arriving years later often sensed the feeling immediately. The castle remained beautiful, exactly as before. Candles still floated above the Great Hall. The moving staircases still shifted unpredictably through ancient towers. Snow still gathered softly along the battlements during winter evenings, while the Black Lake reflected moonlight beyond tall windows. Yet beneath all that familiar magic existed memory. Students entering Hogwarts after the war learned quickly about the Battle of Hogwarts, not only through books, but through the castle itself. Professors spoke quietly about fallen students whose names appeared on memorial plaques beside the Great Hall. Portraits occasionally shared fragments of what they witnessed during the fighting. Older ghosts drifted through corridors, carrying centuries of history alongside newer grief. For the surviving generation, certain places inside Hogwarts never felt entirely ordinary again. The courtyard where Voldemort's forces gathered, the boathouse where Snape died, the room of requirement where resistance fighters hid and prepared for battle, the great hall where so many bodies rested beneath white sheets after dawn arrived. These places became part of magical memory itself. Every year after the war, memorial ceremonies quietly honored those who died defending Hogwarts. Families traveled from across Britain to visit the castle, where sons, daughters, parents, and friends made their final stand against Voldemort. Candles filled the great hall, while names echoed softly beneath the enchanted ceiling. Fred Weasley, Remus Lupin, Nymphadora Tonks, Colin Creevey, Lavender Brown, Severus Snape, countless others. The list remained painfully long. Harry Potter attended many of these ceremonies during the early years, though he often stood apart from crowds afterward. For him, the battle remained deeply personal, no matter how much history surrounded it later. He remembered faces, voices, and moments too vividly for the war ever to become abstract. As time passed, however, younger generations began viewing Harry differently. To children born after Voldemort's fall, Harry Potter increasingly resembled a historical figure rather than an ordinary man. Chocolate frog cards, history lessons, and stories told by parents transformed him slowly into legend. Hogwarts students whispered about him in corridors much the way earlier generations once whispered about Dumbledore. Harry never felt comfortable with this. He understood too well how much of the victory belonged not to one person, but to many. The Battle of Hogwarts succeeded because students, teachers, house elves, centaurs, families, and ordinary witches and wizards chose together to resist fear. That became one of the central lessons the war left behind. Voldemort's rise revealed how dangerous isolation and prejudice could become when allowed to grow unchecked. The wizarding world learned painfully that evil rarely appeared all at once. It spread slowly through fear, silence, denial, and the belief that some lives mattered less than others. These lessons reshaped magical society for decades afterward. Ministry reforms changed laws and institutions permanently. Hogwarts education emphasized magical history more honestly than before. Younger generations questioned old assumptions surrounding blood purity and power far more openly than previous eras. The war also transformed relationships between magical creatures and wizarding society. House elves who fought during the Battle of Hogwarts gained greater recognition afterward. Centaurs became remembered not merely as mysterious forest beings, but as defenders of the castle itself. Even goblin relations improved somewhat, as the ministry slowly acknowledged how exclusion and mistrust contributed to instability. None of these changes happened perfectly or immediately. The wizarding world remained flawed long after Voldemort's death. Prejudice did not vanish entirely. Political arguments continued. Fear occasionally resurfaced during moments of crisis. Yet the generation shaped by the war carried deeper awareness of how quickly darkness could grow if ignored. At Hogwarts, these ideas became woven into student life quietly. Children still competed fiercely between houses and complained about homework exactly as before. Yet beneath those ordinary routines existed stronger understanding that differences between people should not become hatred. Students whose parents fought on opposite sides of the war now shared classrooms, common spaces, and friendships. The castle itself seemed to encourage this healing over time. Hogwarts endured because it always adapted without losing its essential identity. Generations passed through its halls carrying different fears, ambitions, and dreams, yet the school remained connected to all of them. Ancient magic filled the walls, not simply through spells, but through memory accumulated across centuries. Late at night, when corridors emptied and candlelight dimmed, the castle often felt almost alive with remembrance. Portraits whispered softly among themselves about former students now grown old or long dead. Ghosts drifted silently through rooms where generations once studied beneath floating candles. Somewhere deep below the school, the Black Lake moved gently against stone, older than recorded magical history. And high above everything, the astronomy tower still overlooked the highlands, exactly as it had during Dumbledore's final night. The surviving generation aged gradually beneath these memories. McGonagall eventually grew frail after many years guiding Hogwarts through peace. Hagrid's beard turned whiter, while his footsteps slowed slightly across the grounds near the Forbidden Forest. Harry, Ron, Hermione, and Ginny watched their own children grow older and leave Hogwarts behind one by one. Yet even as time moved forward, the Battle of Hogwarts remained strangely close, perhaps because so much of modern magical Britain began there. The battle marked the end of Voldemort's reign, but also the beginning of a different wizarding world, a world where younger generations inherited peace instead of fear, a world where Hogwarts once again became primarily a place of learning rather than survival. That peace came at enormous cost. The castle never allowed anyone to forget it entirely. Students walking through Hogwarts after the war often noticed subtle reminders hidden throughout the school, a repaired wall preserving faint scorch marks from battle, portraits lowering voices while discussing certain names. older professors falling silent briefly while passing memorial spaces. Yet alongside grief, Hogwarts also preserved something else: hope. The castle had survived basilisks, dark wizards, ancient secrets, wars, and centuries of conflict before Voldemort ever arrived. It continued standing afterward because generations of people repeatedly chose to defend it, not merely as a building, but as an idea. A place where children from every background could arrive frightened and uncertain, then leave changed forever. For Harry Potter especially, this truth mattered deeply in later life. He often returned quietly to Hogwarts long after becoming head of the Auror office and raising children of his own. Sometimes he walked alone beside the Black Lake at dusk while mist drifted over dark water. Other times, he stood inside the Great Hall, listening to the familiar sounds of students laughing beneath floating candles. During those moments, Harry sometimes reflected on how strange his life truly became. The lonely boy sleeping beneath a staircase at Privet Drive eventually helped save the wizarding world. Yet in the end, what mattered most to him was not fame or prophecy. It was the simple continuation of life. Children boarding the Hogwarts Express without fear, families gathering peacefully at the Burrow, students arguing about Quidditch scores rather than dark magic. Ordinary magical life continuing beneath ancient castle towers. That became the true legacy of the Battle of Hogwarts. Not victory alone, but survival strong enough to create peace afterward. And so, the wizarding world moved forward year after year, while Hogwarts endured above the Highlands, beneath drifting clouds and endless stars. New generations filled its corridors, carrying books, broomsticks, ambitions, and secrets of their own. Some became heroes, others lived quiet, ordinary lives. The castle welcomed all of them exactly the same, because Hogwarts remembered every generation that passed through its halls. And somewhere within those ancient stone walls, beyond moving staircases and enchanted ceilings, the memory of those who fought during the final battle still lingered softly like candlelight glowing against the dark. And so, our journey through the years after the Deathly Hallows slowly comes to an end. The war that once cast its shadow across the wizarding world faded gradually into memory, leaving behind rebuilt castles, quiet memorials, and generations of witches and wizards who inherited peace instead of fear. Hogwarts endured through it all, standing beside the Black Lake exactly as it always had, watching students arrive beneath grey Scottish skies year after year. Many who survived the war carried invisible scars for the rest of their lives. Yet they also carried forward friendship, love, and the determination to build something gentler than the world they inherited. Children who never knew Voldemort eventually filled the corridors once more, laughing beneath floating candles and boarding the Hogwarts Express without fear in their hearts. And somewhere within the ancient stone walls of Hogwarts, the memory of every student, teacher, ghost, and hero still lingers softly beneath enchanted ceilings and shifting staircases. So tonight, as the castle settles once more into silence beneath the stars, allow the warm lights of Hogwarts and the quiet magic of its endless halls to drift gently beside you into sleep.